My name is Jordan. I am 33 years old, and my bruised twin sister called me whispering that her husband was cheating and hurting her, so we swapped places one last time. That night, he stormed in and barked, "Who the hell do you think you are? Do not you dare look me in the eye." He thought he was threatening his terrified wife. Instead, he picked a fight with a Special Forces soldier. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. The air inside the $5 million luxury penthouse felt thin and artificial, perfectly matching the man who owned it. I stood completely still, in the center of the sprawling chef's kitchen, wearing my twin sister Hailey's oversized silk nightgown. My long hair hung loose intentionally, masking the left side of my face, exactly where Hailey's darkest purple bruise had blossomed the night before. Hailey was currently miles away, safely tucked inside one of my heavily guarded Vanguard safehouses, sipping warm tea and sleeping without fear for the first time in 3 long years. I, on the other hand, was waiting for the predator to come home. The floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the glittering Atlanta skyline. It was a stark contrast to the absolute darkness inside my mind. I had spent the last decade running covert operations in the world's most dangerous war zones, building Vanguard from a small private security firm into a massive corporate intelligence empire. I had faced warlords, insurgents, and international criminals. Yet the rage boiling in my blood tonight was reserved entirely for a man who wore custom-tailored suits and ran a prestigious hedge fund. My brother-in-law, DeAndre. At exactly 11 o'clock, the heavy oak front door was kicked open with enough force to rattle the expensive artwork on the walls. DeAndre stumbled into the foyer. He was a towering, broad-shouldered man whose natural charisma usually commanded boardrooms, but right now, he was a chaotic mess. The heavy scent of premium scotch and the unmistakable lingering stench of cheap, sweet perfume rolled off his clothes. He had clearly just lost a major business deal, and true to his cowardly nature, he had come home to take his professional failures out on his wife. He threw his leather briefcase against the marble floor and stomped into the kitchen, his eyes locking onto my figure in the dim light. He did not notice the slight differences in my posture, or the way my feet were perfectly balanced in a combat stance. He only saw a woman he believed he completely owned and controlled. "What are you staring at?" DeAndre roared, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings. He closed the distance between us in 3 long, aggressive strides. "I lost the Reynolds account today because your pathetic father could not secure the board votes, and you just stand there like a useless mannequin." I kept my head bowed, letting the silence stretch, which only infuriated him more. He reached out and violently grabbed the collar of the silk nightgown, yanking me forward. His breath was hot and reeked of alcohol as he leaned his face inches from mine. "Who the hell do you think you are?" he barked, his grip tightening around the delicate fabric. "Do not you dare look me in the eye." He raised his large right hand, pulling it back to deliver a brutal, open-palm strike that was designed to knock me to the floor. He thought he was striking a terrified, isolated housewife. He had no idea he had just activated a highly trained, combat-hardened soldier. As his hand swung downward, my response was instantaneous and entirely mechanical. I did not flinch. I did not scream. I stepped into his attack effortlessly, deflecting his descending arm with my left forearm. In the same fluid motion, my right hand snapped out, seizing his wrist with a vice-like grip. I pivoted sharply, twisting his arm inward and upward, applying a military-grade joint lock that instantly paralyzed his shoulder and elbow. A sickening crack echoed loudly through the immaculate kitchen as the joint gave way under the extreme pressure. Before his brain could even process the agonizing pain, I drove the heel of my foot straight into the back of his knee. DeAndre's leg buckled instantly. He collapsed onto the cold marble floor with a heavy thud, a raw, piercing scream tearing from his throat. I kept his arm pinned tightly behind his back, pressing my knee firmly against his spine to ensure he could not move a single muscle without experiencing blinding agony. I crouched down slowly, finally pushing the hair out of my face. so he could see my eyes clearly. The shock and pure terror that washed over his features was the most satisfying thing I had witnessed in years. He realized instantly that he was not looking at Hailey. Hailey might fear that pathetic tone, DeAndre, I whispered, my voice like absolute ice. But I do not. I just got back from a tour in Syria. The insurgents I choked out in the desert were significantly tougher than a wife-beating coward who hides behind a hedge fund. He writhed beneath me, gasping for air, tears of pain streaming down his face as he desperately tried to pull his arm free. I applied just a fraction more pressure, and he immediately stopped moving, whimpering in submission. You are crazy, he gasped, his voice trembling. I am going to destroy you. Let me go. I released his arm and stood up, stepping back gracefully. DeAndre scrambled away from me, clutching his injured arm to his chest like a wounded animal. He dragged himself backward until his back hit the kitchen island, his chest heaving. With his uninjured hand, he frantically pulled his smartphone from his pocket, his fingers shaking uncontrollably. He dialed 911 first, screaming into the receiver that a deranged woman had broken into his penthouse and assaulted him. The moment he hung up with the dispatcher, he immediately dialed a second number. I knew exactly who he was calling. He was calling my father, Richard, the man who lived just 3 floors down in the same luxury building and apartment DeAndre paid for. Richard, get up here right now, DeAndre yelled into the phone, spit flying from his lips. Your psychotic other daughter is in my house. She just broke my arm. He threw the phone onto the counter and glared at me with pure, unadulterated hatred. You are dead. I am sending you to federal prison for assault. You picked the wrong man to mess with. I simply smirked, walked over to the customized refrigerator, and calmly poured myself a glass of ice water. The night was just getting started. The distant wail of police sirens began to echo through the city streets below, growing louder by the second. I stood leaning against the kitchen counter, casually taking sips of my ice water, while DeAndre remained huddled on the floor, groaning dramatically and cradling his swollen wrist. He kept shooting me venomous glares, clearly calculating how he would use his wealth and influence to destroy my life the moment the authorities arrived. He truly believed his money made him untouchable. Less than 5 minutes later, the heavy front door swung open again. 2 uniformed police officers stepped cautiously into the foyer, their hands resting defensively on their duty belts. Right on their heels came my parents, Richard and Patricia. They were both dressed in expensive silk pajamas and cashmere robes, having rushed up from their own luxurious unit the moment DeAndre called. My parents had relied on DeAndre's wealth for years to maintain their elite status at the local country club, happily turning a blind eye to the bruises their other daughter hid under heavy makeup. "Oh my God!" DeAndre, Patricia shrieked, rushing past the police officers to kneel beside her son-in-law. She looked at him with frantic concern before turning her head to glare at me, her face contorting with absolute disgust. DeAndre immediately amplified his performance, leaning heavily against my mother. "Officers, arrest her?" he groaned, pointing a trembling finger at me. I came home from a highly stressful day at the office, and this woman broke into my secure home. She ambushed me in my own kitchen and attacked me unprovoked. My arm is broken. The taller of the 2 officers took a step toward me, pulling a notepad from his pocket. "Ma'am, keep your hands where I can see them. Are you armed?" Before I could even answer, Patricia pointed a shaking finger at me, completely taking over the narrative. "She is highly dangerous, officers. You ran off a decade ago to be a glorified mercenary, disgracing this entire family. Now you come back just to murder my son-in-law. Arrest this psycho immediately. She has always been jealous of her sister's successful marriage." I looked at my mother, feeling a profound sense of pity for the woman she had become. I thought about how they had always treated Hailey like the golden child, grooming her to be sold off to a wealthy man who could fund their lavish lifestyle, while I was cast aside as the stubborn, rebellious scapegoat. They had enabled DeAndre's abuse for 3 years, prioritizing their country club memberships and luxury cars over Hailey's physical safety. "I am not armed, officers," I said calmly, setting my water glass down on the granite counter. "And I did not break in. I have a key, and I was given explicit permission to be here by the legal resident of this property, my twin sister Hailey." Richard stepped forward, puffing out his chest to project authority. "Hailey is not here. DeAndre is the primary owner of this penthouse. You committed a violent felony tonight, Jordan. You have always been a massive disappointment to this family, but this crosses the line into criminality. You are going to rot in a jail cell." The officers exchanged a hesitant look. The situation clearly looked bad for me on the surface. I was standing over an injured wealthy homeowner who was actively pressing charges supported by his in-laws. The taller officer unclipped his handcuffs and took another step toward me. "Ma'am, I am going to have to ask you to turn around and place your hands behind your back." "Wait!" I said, my voice cutting through the tension with absolute authority. "Before you make a false arrest based on the testimony of an abuser, you need to hear something." I reached into the pocket of the silk nightgown and pulled out my smartphone. I tapped the screen and opened an encrypted audio file. The recording had been captured by a Vanguard-issued micro device I had discreetly sewn into the eye of a stuffed teddy bear sitting on the living room shelf just hours before Hailey and I swapped places. I pressed play, maximizing the volume so the sound filled the entire kitchen. The audio started with the sound of glass shattering violently against a wall, followed by Hailey's muffled crying. Then DeAndre's voice came through the speakers, loud, aggressive, and completely unhinged. "You think you can question me?" The recorded. DeAndre bellowed. "I control everything in your pathetic life, Hailey. I will sleep with Brittany whenever I want, and you will keep your mouth shut and smile for my clients. If you ever try to leave me, I will destroy your family and I will put you in the hospital permanently. Do you understand me?" More sounds of a struggle echoed from the phone, followed by Hailey sobbing, pleading for him to stop hurting her. The recording ended with the chilling sound of DeAndre laughing mockingly at her pain. The silence in the kitchen was suddenly deafening. The two police officers froze in their tracks, their hands slowly dropping away from their handcuffs. They looked down at DeAndre, their expressions shifting from protective concern to deep professional suspicion. DeAndre's face had drained of all color. He scrambled backward slightly, his injured arm forgotten for a fraction of a second. Patricia stared at her son-in-law, her mouth slightly open, though I knew she had always suspected the truth of what happened behind these closed doors. Richard, however, was too desperate to protect his primary source of income to let a little thing like domestic terrorism get in the way. He sneered, stepping aggressively toward the officers. "Audio can be faked with artificial intelligence these days. Anyone can make a recording say whatever they want. This proves absolutely nothing. This is my son-in-law's house, he pays the mortgage, and he wants her arrested for assault. Get her out of here right now." I smiled, a genuine, terrifying smile. I reached down to the floor where my tactical duffel bag sat hidden behind the kitchen island. I unzipped the main compartment and pulled out a thick legal folder sealed with a bright red court stamp. I slapped the folder onto the kitchen counter, sliding it directly in front of the police officers. The real game was finally starting. I did not just slide the folder across the granite island. I slammed it down with enough force to make my father flinch. The red emergency court stamp on the cover glowed under the kitchen's pendant lights. The taller police officer immediately reached for it, his eyes scanning the first page. "That is an emergency ex parte federal restraining order," I announced, my voice slicing through the heavy silence of the room. "Signed at 9 o'clock tonight by a federal judge. It is based on the audio you just heard, the medical records I submitted from Hailey's emergency room visits over the last 2 years, and sworn affidavits from the Vanguard security detail who extracted her this afternoon." Richard stepped forward, his face turning a dangerous shade of crimson. "This is a joke. You cannot circumvent the law with some midnight paperwork. DeAndre owns this building. His name is on the deed." "His name is on the deed," I agreed, leaning forward and tapping the second page of the document. "But his signature is on the prenuptial agreement. The same ironclad, ruthless prenup he forced my sister to sign 3 days before their wedding to protect his precious hedge fund. He thought he was brilliant. He thought he was untouchable. He thought he had trapped her forever. But arrogant men always leave a blind spot." I turned my gaze to DeAndre. He was still clutching his broken arm against the cabinets, his chest heaving with panicked breaths. "You drafted a morality clause, DeAndre. You wanted to make sure if Hailey ever embarrassed you, you could throw her out with nothing. But the clause works both ways." Section 4. Paragraph 12. In the event of documented domestic violence, exclusive and immediate possession of the marital residence defaults entirely to the victim. Patricia gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. You cannot enforce that. Hailey is not even here. She is probably having a mental breakdown somewhere. She cannot legally enforce anything right now. I pulled one final sheet of paper from the back of the folder. Hailey does not have to be here, because as of yesterday morning, I am her legally appointed power of attorney. I hold full control over her legal decisions. I hold full control over her medical decisions. I hold full control over her financial assets until she is safe and fully recovered. I looked directly at the two officers. Gentlemen, according to that federal order, the man on the floor is currently trespassing on my sister's property. He is a documented threat. I want him removed. The officers finished reading the documents. The taller one closed the folder and looked at DeAndre. The deference and respect they had shown the billionaire hedge fund manager just 5 minutes ago completely vanished. Sir, the officer said, his tone entirely professional and entirely unyielding. You need to vacate the premises immediately. DeAndre's jaw dropped. The sheer impossibility of the situation was breaking his brain. Are you out of your minds? He shrieked, his voice cracking. Look at my arm. She assaulted me. I am the victim here. I pay your salaries with my taxes. I want her in handcuffs. We heard the tape, sir, the second officer said, resting his hand on his radio. And we are looking at a judge's signature ordering you to leave. You can press assault charges tomorrow with your lawyers if you want to test that audio in court. But tonight, you are leaving this penthouse. Now. I checked my smartwatch. As Hailey's power of attorney, I am giving you exactly 5 minutes to pack a bag and get off my sister's property, DeAndre. If you are still here in 6 minutes, I will ask these officers to arrest you for violating a federal protection order. Richard lunged forward, grabbing my arm. Jordan, stop this madness right now. You are humiliating him. I grabbed my father's wrist and twisted it just enough to make him gasp and release me. Do not ever touch me again, Dad. Your country club membership does not mean anything in this room. Stand back and watch your investment crumble. DeAndre pushed himself off the floor, groaning in agony. He stumbled toward the hallway leading to the master suite. I need my luggage, he muttered, his face pale with pain and rage. I need my Louis Vuitton trunks and my watches. Access denied, I said, stepping swiftly into the hallway and blocking his path. The master suite is restricted. You are not going in there to tamper with evidence. You are not going in there to hide your assets. You are not going in there at all. I reached into the utility closet next to the pantry, pulled out a heavy-duty black plastic trash bag, and tossed it directly at his feet. You can take whatever is in the coat closet by the front door. I believe your golf jackets and a few pairs of shoes are in there. Pack them up. DeAndre stared at the trash bag, his billionaire ego shattering into a million pieces. I am not putting my bespoke suits in a garbage bag, he whispered, his voice shaking with absolute humiliation. 4 minutes, I replied, crossing my arms. Under the stern, watchful eyes of the two armed police officers, the multimillionaire CEO of Apex Capital was forced to crouch down with one functioning arm. He awkwardly grabbed his expensive cashmere coats and Italian leather loafers from the hall closet, shoving them indiscriminately into the black plastic trash bag. He was sweating profusely, his broken wrist hanging uselessly at his side. He looked pathetic. He looked weak. He looked exactly like the small, frightened man he truly was. When the 5 minutes were up, the officers escorted him toward the heavy oak front door. DeAndre threw the trash bag over his good shoulder. He turned to look at me one last time, his eyes burning with a promise of violent revenge. But he said nothing. He knew he had lost this battle. The officers walked him out of the penthouse, down the lavish hallway, and into the private elevator. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, I watched the street below. A few minutes later, the front doors of the luxury building opened. DeAndre was escorted out into the pouring, relentless Atlanta rain. He stood on the curb, shivering in his ruined silk pajamas, holding a trash bag, waiting for a taxi, because his custom sports cars were all legally registered in Hailey's name under the corporate holding company. The sound of heavy, frantic breathing pulled my attention back to the foyer. Patricia and Richard were still standing by the door. My mother's face was streaked with running mascara. Her perfect socialite mask was entirely destroyed. She stepped toward me, her hands balled into tight fists, screaming at the top of her lungs. "You just ruined a billion-dollar marriage. You destroyed everything we built for this family," Patricia shrieked, her voice echoing wildly off the marble walls. "You think you won because you kicked him out into the rain? You stupid, arrogant girl. Tomorrow morning, DeAndre is freezing the family trust. He is cutting off every single dime. And your father and I are going straight to a judge to strip your power of attorney. You will have nothing, and Hailey will be locked in a psychiatric ward by noon." The heavy oak doors slammed shut, cutting off my mother's hysterical threats, but her shrill voice echoed in the hallway. I locked the deadbolt, ignoring her frantic pounding against the wood. Let her scream. Let her threaten. The era of their absolute control over my sister had just violently ended. Across town, the relentless Atlanta rain was soaking through DeAndre's ruined silk pajamas. He stood shivering on the sidewalk, clutching his broken wrist against his chest, holding a black plastic trash bag filled with expensive shoes. The multimillionaire hedge fund CEO was completely unrecognizable. He practically threw himself into the back of a passing taxi, barking an address in the affluent Buckhead district. He was heading straight to the one place he believed he still held absolute power. 10 minutes later, DeAndre was standing in the sleek, ultra-modern foyer of a $2 million condominium. The owner of the condo, Brittany, stood wrapped in a plush robe, staring at him in shock. Brittany was 28 years old, ruthlessly ambitious, and the vice president of acquisitions at DeAndre's firm. More importantly, she was his mistress. DeAndre pushed past her, his face contorted in agony and rage. He dropped the trash bag onto her pristine white rug and demanded she get him ice and painkillers. As Brittany rushed to the kitchen, DeAndre collapsed into a leather chair in her home office. He was already calculating his revenge. Brittany returned with a makeshift sling and a glass of water. She watched in disbelief as he awkwardly booted up her desktop computer with his uninjured hand. DeAndre spat out a venomous, twisted version of the night's events, claiming Hailey had completely lost her mind and ambushed him with a weapon. Brittany scoffed, leaning over his shoulder to look at the screen. "She did not ambush you," Brittany said, her voice laced with arrogant amusement. "Hailey does not have the spine to fight back. You made sure of that. You spent the last 3 years systematically breaking her down. You monitored her phone, you cut her off from her friends, and you convinced her she was too emotionally unstable to handle her own inheritance." DeAndre grimaced as a sharp pain shot up his arm, but a dark, proud smirk crept onto his face. Brittany continued her tone, admiring the cruelty of his long con. "You literally gaslit that woman into signing over every single one of her independent assets into your wealth management portfolio just to prove she trusted you as her husband. She does not have a single independent asset left in her name. She is entirely dependent on the allowance you give her. So how did she suddenly get a lawyer and a federal judge to kick you out?" "I do not know." DeAndre growled, his fingers clumsily, typing in his administrative passwords. "But it does not matter. The prenup might give her the physical house if she cries abuse, but I control the liquidity. I am initiating a sweep of all our joint accounts right now. I am moving every liquid asset into your offshore trust in the Cayman Islands. By the time the sun comes up, my dear wife will not have enough money to buy a cup of coffee, let alone pay a legal team." While DeAndre and Brittany orchestrated their digital theft, Richard and Patricia were not making empty threats. Standing in the lobby of the penthouse building, my father pulled out his phone and made a 2 o'clock in the morning phone call to his old college roommate. His friend happened to be the senior vice president of Liberty National Bank, the institution that held Hailey's emergency medical trust. Richard used his elite social standing and immense corporate leverage to call in a massive favor. He falsely claimed that Hailey was experiencing a severe psychiatric break and was a danger to herself. He demanded the bank put an immediate hard freeze on her emergency funds to prevent her from making erratic financial decisions. Without a formal court order based purely on the toxic network of the Old Boys Club, the bank executive complied. The enablers were starving the victim out, fully intending to force her to come crawling back to her abuser out of sheer financial desperation. Miles away from the city center, the atmosphere could not have been more different. The Vanguard safe house was a fortress hidden in plain sight. From the outside, it looked like a standard high-end suburban home. Inside it was a tactical command center equipped with bulletproof glass-reinforced steel doors and a closed-circuit cybersecurity network. I walked into the softly lit living room. Hailey was sitting on a plush sofa wrapped tightly in a thick wool blanket. The stark contrast between us was heartbreaking. We shared the exact same face, the same eyes, and the same voice. But while I stood tall in my tactical gear, my posture radiating absolute certainty, Hailey looked fragile, exhausted, and weighed down by years of invisible chains. I sat down next to her, handing her a mug of chamomile tea. "It is done," I said gently. "He is out of the house. You never have to sleep with one eye open again." Hailey offered a small, trembling smile, her fingers wrapping around the warm mug. For a moment, the heavy tension in the room began to lift, but in the world of high-stakes corporate warfare, peace is always temporary. A sharp, piercing alarm echoed from the kitchen island. I stood up immediately and walked over to my communication station. 3 monitors were set up side by side, displaying Vanguard's real-time financial tracking software. The screens were flashing bright red. Hailey stood up, the blanket slipping from her shoulders. Her voice shook with rising panic. "Jordan, what is that? What is happening?" I analyzed the data, scrolling rapidly across the center monitor. DeAndre is initiating mass wire transfers. He is draining the joint marital accounts and attempting to route the funds into an offshore shell company registered to Brittany. Before Hailey could even process the theft of her marital funds, a second red alert popped up on the screen. "And Liberty National just placed a hard freeze on your emergency medical trust," I added, my eyes narrowing at the digital footprint. The authorization came directly from the senior vice president. Dad made the call. Hailey dropped her mug. It shattered against the hardwood floor, hot tea spilling everywhere. The sound mirrored the sudden shattering of her fragile hope. She backed away, her hands clutching her head as a full-blown panic attack set in. "They took it all!" Hailey sobbed, her chest heaving as she struggled to breathe. "I told you this would happen, Jordan. Dad always said DeAndre controlled the entire financial board. They froze everything. We have no money for the lawyers. We have no money to fight them in court. They starved me out again. DeAndre always wins." I stepped over the broken porcelain and walked back to the tactical table. I did not raise my voice. I did not show an ounce of fear. I calmly unzipped the protective case of my primary operational laptop. "Hailey, look at me." I commanded, my voice cutting through her panic like a blade. "Breathe. They are operating on old intelligence. They are playing a game of checkers while I am resetting the entire board." "But Dad froze the accounts at Liberty National," she cried, tears spilling over her bruised cheek. "He cut off our only supply line." I flipped open the heavy military-grade laptop, the bright blue light of the screen illuminating my face. My fingers flew across the encrypted keyboard, executing a protocol I had prepared weeks in advance. I looked up from the screen, staring directly into my sister's terrified eyes. "They think they cut off our supply line," I said, a cold, dangerous smile spreading across my lips. "They do not realize I own the bank." I tapped the thick stack of papers inside the folder. "That is an emergency ex parte federal restraining order," I announced, my voice slicing through the heavy silence of the kitchen. "Signed at 9 o'clock tonight by a federal judge. It is based on the audio you just heard, the medical records I submitted from Hailey's emergency room visits over the last 2 years, and sworn affidavits from the Vanguard security detail who extracted her this afternoon." Richard stepped forward, his face turning a dangerous shade of crimson. "This is a joke. You cannot circumvent the law with some midnight paperwork. DeAndre owns this building. His name is on the deed." "His name is on the deed," I agreed, pulling the second document from the folder. "But his signature is on the prenuptial agreement. The same ironclad prenup he forced my sister to sign 3 days before their wedding. He thought he was brilliant. But arrogant men always leave a blind spot. I turned my gaze to DeAndre. He was still clutching his broken arm against the cabinets, his chest heaving. You drafted a morality clause, DeAndre. You wanted to make sure if Hailey ever embarrassed you, you could throw her out with nothing. But the clause works both ways. Section 4, paragraph 12. In the event of documented domestic violence, exclusive and immediate possession of the marital residence defaults entirely to the victim. Patricia gasped. You cannot enforce that. Hailey is not even here. I pulled one final sheet of paper. Hailey does not have to be here. Because as of yesterday morning, I am her legally appointed power of attorney. I hold full control over her legal and financial decisions. I looked directly at the two officers. Gentlemen, according to that federal order, the man on the floor is currently trespassing on my sister's property. He is a documented threat. I want him removed. The taller officer scanned the documents. The deference they had shown the billionaire completely vanished. Sir, the officer said, you need to vacate the premises immediately. DeAndre's jaw dropped. Are you out of your minds? He shrieked. Look at my arm. She assaulted me. I want her in handcuffs. We heard the tape, sir, the second officer said, and we are looking at a judge's signature ordering you to leave. You can press assault charges tomorrow with your lawyers, but tonight you are leaving this penthouse. Now. I checked my smartwatch. And as Hailey's legally appointed power of attorney, I am giving you exactly 5 minutes to pack a bag and get off my sister's property, DeAndre. Richard lunged forward, grabbing my arm. Jordan, stop this madness right now. You are humiliating him. I grabbed my father's wrist and twisted it just enough to make him release me. Stand back and watch your investment crumble. DeAndre pushed himself off the floor, groaning in agony. I need my luggage, he muttered. I need my designer trunks and my watches. Access denied, I said, stepping into the hallway and blocking his path. The master suite is restricted. I reached into the utility closet, pulled out a heavy black plastic trash bag and tossed it at his feet. You can take whatever is in the coat closet by the front door. Pack them up. Under the stern eyes of the armed police officers, the multi-millionaire hedge fund CEO was forced to crouch down. He awkwardly grabbed his expensive cashmere coats and Italian leather loafers, shoving them indiscriminately into the trash bag. He was sweating profusely. He looked exactly like the small, frightened man he truly was. When the 5 minutes were up, the officers escorted him out. DeAndre threw the trash bag over his good shoulder. He turned to look at me one last time, his eyes burning with a promise of violent revenge. A few minutes later, through the floor-to-ceiling windows, I watched DeAndre get escorted out into the pouring Atlanta rain. He stood on the curb, shivering in his ruined silk pajamas, holding a trash bag. Patricia and Richard were still standing by the door. My mother stepped toward me, her hands balled into tight fists, screaming at the top of her lungs. You just ruined a billion-dollar marriage, you stupid, arrogant girl. Tomorrow morning, DeAndre is freezing the family trust, and your father and I are going straight to court to strip your power of attorney. You will have nothing, and Hailey will be locked in a psychiatric ward by noon. Across town, the relentless rain hammered against the floor-to-ceiling windows of an upscale Buckhead condominium. DeAndre stood shivering in the sleek foyer, leaving wet footprints on the pristine white rug. The owner of the condo, Brittany, stood wrapped in a plush silk robe, staring at him in shock. Brittany was 28 years old, ruthlessly ambitious, and the vice president of acquisitions at DeAndre's firm. She was also his mistress. DeAndre pushed past her, his face contorted in agony and rage. He dropped the trash bag onto the floor and demanded she get him ice and painkillers. As Brittany rushed to the kitchen, DeAndre collapsed into a leather chair in her home office. He was already calculating his revenge. Brittany returned with a makeshift sling and a glass of water. She watched in disbelief as he awkwardly booted up her desktop computer with his uninjured hand. DeAndre spat out a venomous, twisted version of the night's events, claiming Hailey had completely lost her mind and ambushed him. Brittany scoffed, leaning over his shoulder to look at the screen. She did not ambush you, DeAndre, Brittany said, her voice laced with arrogant amusement. Hailey does not have the spine to fight back. You made sure of that. You spent the last 3 years systematically breaking her down. You isolated her. You literally gaslit that woman into signing over every single one of her independent assets into your wealth management portfolio just to prove she trusted you. She does not have a single independent asset left in her name. So how did she suddenly get a lawyer and a federal judge to kick you out? I do not know. DeAndre growled, his fingers clumsily typing in his administrative passwords. But it does not matter. The prenup might give her the physical house if she cries abuse, but I control the liquidity. I am initiating a sweep of all our joint accounts right now. I am moving every liquid asset into your offshore trust in the Cayman Islands. By the time the sun comes up, my dear wife will not have enough money to buy a cup of coffee. While DeAndre and Brittany orchestrated their digital theft, Richard and Patricia were not making empty threats. Standing in the lobby of the penthouse building, my father pulled out his phone and made a 2 o'clock in the morning phone call to his old college roommate. His friend happened to be the senior vice president of Liberty National Bank, the institution that held Hailey's emergency medical trust. Richard used his elite social standing to call in a massive favor. He falsely claimed that Hailey was experiencing a severe psychiatric break and was a danger to herself. He demanded the bank put an immediate hard freeze on her emergency funds. Without a formal court order, the bank executive complied. The enablers were starving the victim out, fully intending to force her to come crawling back out of sheer financial desperation. Miles away from the city center, the atmosphere could not have been more different. The Vanguard safe house was a fortress hidden in plain sight. I walked into the softly lit living room. Hailey was sitting on a plush sofa wrapped tightly in a thick wool blanket. The stark contrast between us was heartbreaking. While I stood tall in my tactical gear, Hailey looked fragile and exhausted. I sat down next to her, handing her a mug of warm tea. "It is done," I said gently. "He is out of the house. You never have to sleep with one eye open again." Hailey offered a small, trembling smile. But in the world of high-stakes corporate warfare, peace is always temporary. A sharp, piercing alarm echoed from my communication station in the kitchen. I stood up immediately and walked over to the monitors displaying Vanguard's real-time financial tracking software. The screens were flashing bright red. Hailey stood up, the blanket slipping from her shoulders. Her voice shook with rising panic. "Jordan, what is that? What is happening?" I analyzed the data scrolling rapidly across the center monitor. DeAndre is initiating mass wire transfers. He is draining the joint marital accounts and attempting to route the funds into an offshore shell company registered to Brittany. Before Hailey could even process the theft of her marital funds, a second red alert popped up on the screen. "And Liberty National just placed a hard freeze on your emergency medical trust," I added. The authorization came directly from the senior vice president. Dad made the call. Hailey dropped her mug. It shattered against the hardwood floor. She backed away, her hands clutching her head as a panic attack set in. "They took it all," Hailey sobbed, her chest heaving as she struggled to breathe. "I told you this would happen, Jordan. Dad always said DeAndre controlled the entire financial board. They froze everything. We have no money for the lawyers. They starved me out again. DeAndre always wins." I stepped over the broken porcelain and walked back to the tactical table. I did not raise my voice. I did not show an ounce of fear. I calmly unzipped the protective case of my primary operational laptop. "Hailey, look at me," I commanded, my voice cutting through her panic like a blade. "Breathe. They are operating on old intelligence. They are playing a game of checkers while I am resetting the entire board." "But Dad froze the accounts at Liberty National," she cried. "He cut off our only supply line." I flipped open the heavy military-grade laptop. My fingers flew across the encrypted keyboard, executing a protocol I had prepared weeks in advance. I looked up from the screen, staring directly into my sister's terrified eyes. "They think they cut off our supply line," I said. "They do not realize I own the bank." The next afternoon, the sun was shining brightly over the manicured green lawns of the Oakmont Elite Country Club. To control the narrative and suppress any rumors of DeAndre's midnight eviction, Richard and Patricia hosted a lavish impromptu luncheon in the club's private dining room. They invited the most influential socialites, board members, and local politicians. DeAndre and Brittany were seated at the head table as VIP guests. The strategy was painfully transparent. My parents were using their elite platform to publicly forgive DeAndre for whatever minor marital dispute had occurred while simultaneously painting Hailey as a mentally unstable, hysterical woman who needed immediate psychiatric intervention. DeAndre sat with his arm in a fresh professional cast, playing the role of the exhausted, devoted husband perfectly. Brittany sat close to his side, whispering in his ear and sipping champagne. The dining room was filled with the soft clinking of crystal glasses and the low murmur of wealthy gossip. Patricia was just standing up to make a toast to family resilience when the heavy double doors of the dining room swung open. I walked into the room dressed in a stunning razor-sharp designer suit that screamed power and absolute authority. My hair was pulled back into a severe, flawless style, and my posture commanded the immediate attention of every single person in the room. The soft music seemed to stop. The clinking of glasses ceased. The entire dining room went dead quiet as I took slow, deliberate steps across the imported carpet. Everyone stared, assuming I was Hailey. They saw the woman they had been gossiping about, the supposed hysterical housewife. But the predator energy radiating from my every step told a completely different story. Patricia froze, her champagne glass trembling in her hand. DeAndre's face drained of all color, his good hand gripping the edge of the tablecloth. He knew exactly who I was. Brittany, however, was entirely clueless. She saw an opportunity to humiliate the woman she believed she had just financially ruined. She stood up from the head table, grabbing a fresh mimosa, and marched confidently toward me. She wore a smug, condescending smile that made me want to break her jaw. Brittany intentionally bumped into my shoulder, tipping her glass forward and spilling cold mimosa directly onto my designer shoes. "Oops," Brittany said loudly, making sure the surrounding tables could hear her. "Sorry, Hailey. I heard you are penniless today." "Do not worry, DeAndre just moved all your marital assets into my offshore trust. Maybe you can apply for a job cleaning the country club bathrooms." I did not flinch. I did not look down at my shoes. I kept my eyes locked onto Brittany's face, my expression completely unreadable. The silence in the dining room was now suffocating. Everyone was waiting for the supposed mental breakdown my parents had been predicting all afternoon. Instead, I calmly raised my hand and snapped my fingers. The club manager, a man who had catered to my parents' every whim for 2 decades, immediately hurried forward. He looked incredibly nervous, sweating profusely under his stiff collar. He stopped a respectful distance away and bowed his head slightly. "Tell them," I said, my voice echoing clearly across the silent dining room. "Tell them whose name is on the deed to this property as of 9 o'clock this morning." The manager swallowed hard, pulling a certified legal document from his jacket pocket. He looked at Richard and Patricia, then back to me, his voice shaking. "The Oakmont Elite Country Club was fully acquired in a cash buyout this morning," he announced to the room. "The sole owner and governing authority of this property is now Vanguard Intelligence, represented by the CEO, Miss Jordan." The collective gasp from the elite dining room was absolute music to my ears. Patricia staggered backward, her manicured hand flying to her chest, as if she had just been physically struck. Richard's face contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated shock. He looked at the club manager, his voice a strained, breathless whisper. "Arthur, tell me this is a sick joke. We have been platinum members here for 20 years. I sit on the advisory committee. You cannot just sell the property out from under the founding families without a formal board vote." Arthur adjusted his tie, his eyes darting nervously around the room, avoiding my father's gaze. "I am sorry, Richard. The board kept it strictly confidential, but the club has been hemorrhaging money for a decade. We were facing total bankruptcy and public foreclosure by the end of the quarter. Vanguard Intelligence offered a blind full cash buyout at double the market value to clear the debts. The executives had no choice but to sign the paperwork at dawn." I stepped forward, the heels of my designer shoes clicking sharply against the hardwood floor. "So when you sent out those lavish invitations to celebrate my sister's abuser, you were actually hosting a party in my dining room, eating my catered food, and drinking my imported champagne. You wanted to control the narrative, Mother. But you forgot to check who owned the stage." Patricia opened her mouth to scream, but no words came out. She just stared at me, completely paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of her social humiliation. The other wealthy patrons were already whispering, their eyes darting between my parents and me. Brittany stood frozen, the empty mimosa glass trembling in her hand. The smug, condescending smile had completely vanished from her face, replaced by a sudden dawning terror. I turned my attention fully to her, closing the distance between us until I was standing just inches away. She reeked of cheap floral perfume and desperation. "You were so eager to brag about draining my sister's marital assets in front of an audience," I said, my voice smooth and dangerously calm. "Keep them. Keep every single penny you stole at 2 o'clock this morning. You are going to need them to pay for your legal defense." Brittany blinked, stepping backward until her hip bumped against the head table. "My legal defense? What are you talking about? I did not do anything illegal. DeAndre authorized those transfers. He told me it was standard wealth management protocol. DeAndre used your personal terminal, your home IP address, and your digital signature to route millions of dollars into an offshore shell company, registered exclusively in your name," I explained, letting the harsh reality sink into her skull. "Did you really think the CEO of a multi-billion-dollar private intelligence firm would just sit by and let you steal from my twin sister? While you two were laughing in your condo, my cybersecurity team was already inside your network. We tracked the destination accounts. We mapped the entire digital footprint." I leaned in closer, dropping my voice so only she and DeAndre could hear the final, devastating blow. "Did you know my cybersecurity team just forwarded your encrypted offshore ledgers directly to the Securities and Exchange Commission?" Brittany dropped her glass. It shattered against the floor, but nobody moved. She turned to DeAndre, her chest heaving with panic. "You used my signature. You set me up as the fall guy for federal embezzlement." "Shut up, Brittany!" DeAndre snapped, his voice cracking with rising panic. Right on cue, the silence of the dining room was shattered by the frantic, continuous buzzing of a cell phone. DeAndre frantically reached into his jacket pocket with his uninjured hand and pulled out his phone. The screen was lighting up with rapid-fire notifications. It was not just one call. It was a relentless avalanche of texts, emails, and emergency alerts. His face turned an ashen gray as he scrolled through the messages, his eyes widening in absolute horror. Seconds later, several other phones across the dining room began to chime and buzz. The news was hitting the financial wires. "What did you do?" DeAndre breathed, looking up at me like he was staring at the Grim Reaper. "I sent a small anonymous data packet to every single one of your major investors," I said, projecting my voice so my parents could hear exactly what kind of man they had been protecting. "I showed them the offshore accounts. I showed them the shell companies. I showed them how you have been systematically laundering Apex Capital client funds to cover up your massive trading losses over the last 4 years. And I showed them how you used your naive vice president's signature to execute the fraud." DeAndre looked back at his phone, his thumb swiping desperately across the screen. "They are pulling out. The Reynolds account, the Sterling Trust, the pension funds, they are all submitting emergency withdrawal requests. You just triggered a bank run on my entire firm." I triggered transparency. I corrected him, stepping back and folding my arms. "You built an empire on lies, intimidation, and abuse. I simply turned on the lights so everyone could see the rats scatter." Patricia rushed forward, grabbing DeAndre's good arm, her eyes wide with a new kind of terror. "DeAndre, tell me she is lying. Tell me our retirement funds are safe. We put everything into Apex Capital. We gave you full control." DeAndre ignored her, shoving her hands away with a violent jerk that made my father step forward defensively. The facade of the charming, wealthy son-in-law was completely gone, leaving only a cornered, desperate animal. The realization that he was losing his company, his wealth, and his freedom was finally crashing down on him. He looked around the room, seeing the disgusted faces of the elite socialites and politicians who had praised him just moments ago. People were already standing up, grabbing their coats, eager to distance themselves from a sinking ship. He was ruined in Atlanta. He was ruined globally. But malignant narcissists never surrender gracefully. They always look for one final destructive blow to drag everyone else down with them. DeAndre slammed his good fist down on the head table, rattling the crystal champagne flutes and knocking a floral arrangement to the floor. his eyes locked onto mine, blazing with a toxic mix of hatred and manic desperation. "You think you are smart?" DeAndre sneered, spit flying from his lips as he stepped toward me, completely unhinged. "You think you can just march in here and destroy my life without catastrophic collateral damage? I am the majority shareholder of Apex Medical, the company your father runs." The entire room sucked in a collective breath. Apex Medical was the pharmaceutical manufacturing company my father managed. It was the absolute crown jewel of our family's generational wealth, the very institution Richard had spent his entire life building, only to sell a controlling stake to DeAndre to fund his lavish lifestyle. "That is right." DeAndre laughed, a harsh, ugly sound that echoed in the silent room. "I own your father's company. I control the board of directors. And tomorrow morning the board will vote to liquidate every single one of Hailey's legacy shares to cover my immediate hedge fund losses. You might have taken my house, Jordan, but I am going to bankrupt your entire bloodline." The sun rose over Atlanta the next morning, casting a deceptive golden warmth over a city that ran entirely on cutthroat corporate warfare. I left the Vanguard safe house at dawn. Hailey was finally resting peacefully secured behind reinforced steel doors and a team of heavily armed tactical guards. She had spent the last 3 years living in a constant state of psychological terror, manipulated and isolated by the very people who were supposed to protect her. She needed time to heal and process the trauma. I, however, needed time to hunt. They had declared war on my blood, and I was going to dismantle their entire empire brick by arrogant brick. By noon, the atmosphere at the Oakmont Elite Country Club was suffocatingly opulent. The manicured green lawns gleamed under the bright sky, and a fleet of luxury vehicles lined the valet entrance. This club was the absolute epicenter of high society in the state. Membership was passed down through generations, and its private dining room was where reputations were forged, fortunes were merged, and scandals were quietly buried. Today, Richard and Patricia were hosting a lavish invite-only luncheon. They had booked the grand ballroom, filling the expansive space with imported white orchids, crystal chandeliers, and the wealthiest socialites, board members, and politicians in their vast network. Their strategy was painfully transparent. My parents were executing a preemptive strike to control the narrative before any rumors of DeAndre's midnight eviction could leak to the press. They had invited DeAndre and Brittany as their VIP guests. DeAndre sat at the head table, his broken wrist secured in a professional, custom-fitted medical sling. He was playing the role of the exhausted, long-suffering, and devoted husband to absolute perfection. Brittany sat pressed against his good side, sipping vintage champagne and wearing a diamond necklace paid for by my sister's stolen inheritance. Patricia moved gracefully between the linen-draped tables, whispering poisonous, calculated lies into the ears of her elite peers. She claimed Hailey had suffered a tragic, violent mental breakdown. She spun a fabricated tale of how DeAndre had tried desperately to save her, but Hailey had become completely unhinged and a danger to herself. Richard stood nearby, nodding solemnly, playing the grieving patriarch forced to make hard decisions for the good of the family. They were publicly forgiving DeAndre for whatever minor marital dispute had occurred, while simultaneously preparing the social ground to have Hailey permanently institutionalized. They were throwing their own flesh and blood to the wolves just to maintain their social standing and secure DeAndre's hedge fund capital. The luncheon was in full swing. A string quartet played softly in the corner, providing a sophisticated soundtrack to the character assassination of my twin sister. DeAndre raised his uninjured hand to silence the room, preparing to give a heartfelt, fabricated speech about family resilience. Before he could utter a single word, the heavy mahogany double doors of the grand ballroom swung violently open. I walked into the dining room. I did not wear the pastel, submissive dresses my parents had always forced upon my sister. I wore a stunning, razor-sharp designer suit in midnight black. The cut was immaculate, projecting an aura of absolute lethal authority. My hair was pulled back into a severe, flawless style, and my posture commanded the immediate attention of every single person in the room. The string quartet faltered, a cellist missing a note in sheer surprise. The clinking of silver forks against porcelain plates ceased completely. The low murmur of wealthy gossip evaporated into thin air. The entire dining room went dead quiet. Everyone stared. They assumed I was Hailey. They saw the woman they had just been gossiping about, the supposed hysterical housewife who had lost her mind. But the predator energy radiating from my every step told a completely different story. I walked with the cold, calculated precision of a woman who owned the very ground she stood on. Patricia dropped her linen napkin, her face turning an ashen gray. Richard gripped the back of his chair, his eyes widening in unadulterated shock. DeAndre visibly recoiled, his good hand flying to protect his broken wrist. He knew exactly who I was. He remembered the tactical gear and the sound of his own bones snapping. But Brittany was entirely clueless. She had not been at the penthouse. She only knew the weak, broken version of Hailey that DeAndre had described to her. Brittany saw an opportunity to publicly humiliate the woman she believed she had just financially ruined. She wanted to assert her dominance and cement her position as the new queen of the chessboard. Brittany stood up from the head table, grabbing a fresh, brimming mimosa. She marched confidently toward me, her hips swaying with arrogant entitlement. She wore a smug, condescending smile that begged to be wiped away permanently. She stopped right in front of me, intentionally bumping her shoulder into mine. With a dramatic, exaggerated motion, she tipped her crystal glass forward. The cold, sticky orange liquid splashed directly onto my designer shoes, pooling on the polished hardwood floor. "Oops," Brittany said, her voice amplified in the silent room. "Sorry, Hailey. I heard you are penniless today. Do not worry, DeAndre just moved all your marital assets into my offshore trust. I have the confirmation ledgers right on my phone. You should probably get used to cleaning up other people's messes." The surrounding socialites gasped. The cruelty was staggering. They waited with bated breath for the inevitable breakdown. They expected me to burst into tears, to scream, to run out of the room, humiliated and defeated. I did not flinch. I did not even look down at my ruined shoes. I kept my eyes locked directly onto Brittany's face. My expression remained completely unreadable, a blank mask of absolute calm. Slowly, a cold, dangerous smile spread across my lips. It was not a smile of surrender. It was the smile of a hunter watching prey walk willingly into a steel trap. I raised my hand and snapped my fingers. The sharp sound cracked like a whip in the silent ballroom. The club manager, Mr. Sterling, a man who had catered to my parents' every arrogant whim for 2 decades, immediately rushed forward. He was sweating profusely, his face pale with raw terror. He stopped a respectful distance away and bowed his head slightly, completely ignoring Richard and DeAndre. I kept my eyes fixed on Brittany's rapidly fading smile. "Tell them whose name is on the deed to this property as of 9 a.m. today." Patricia let out a strangled gasp, her hands flying to her pearl necklace, as if the very air in the room had suddenly been stolen. Richard stumbled backward a half step, his face pale and entirely devoid of the smug, untouchable patriarch persona he had worn all afternoon. The Oakmont Elite Country Club was their absolute sanctuary. It was the heavily guarded fortress of their social standing, the exclusive stage where they had systematically belittled Hailey for years while spinning their toxic narratives to anyone wealthy enough to listen. And now I owned it. Arthur Richards stammered, his voice cracking under the weight of his profound public humiliation. "This is impossible. We are legacy members here. I sit on the executive advisory committee. You cannot just sell the entire establishment out from under the founding families without a formal board vote." Arthur took a nervous step away from my father, clutching his leather folio like a protective shield. The advisory board was bypassed. "Richard," Arthur admitted, his voice dropping to a frantic, terrified whisper. "The club has been hemorrhaging money for a decade. We were facing total bankruptcy and public foreclosure by Friday afternoon. Vanguard Intelligence swooped in with a blind full cash buyout that cleared every single deficit. The final paperwork was executed at dawn. Miss Jordan holds absolute operational control." The elite audience erupted into a cacophony of panicked whispers. The wealthy socialites who had just been drinking my parents' imported champagne and laughing at my twin sister's expense were suddenly calculating how quickly they could align themselves with the new owner. Loyalty in Buckhead lasted exactly as long as the money did. I turned my gaze away from my horrified parents and locked eyes with Brittany. She was still frozen by the head table, the broken glass of her mimosa pooling around her designer heels. The arrogant smirk she had worn just moments ago had completely evaporated. In its place was the dawning realization that she had walked blindly into a slaughterhouse. "Keep the marital assets, Brittany," I said, my voice cutting through the ambient noise of the dining room with lethal precision. "Keep every single penny DeAndre wired into your Cayman Island accounts at 2 o'clock this morning. You are going to need all of it for your legal defense." Brittany swallowed hard, her eyes darting nervously toward DeAndre. "Legal defense? What are you talking about? I did not do anything illegal. DeAndre authorized those transfers. He told me it was standard wealth management protocol to secure liquid assets during a marital dispute." I took a slow, deliberate step toward her. "DeAndre is a coward, Brittany. When a coward realizes his ship is sinking, he always looks for a scapegoat. He did not use his own administrative credentials to authorize those offshore transfers. He used your personal terminal. He used your home network. And he used your digital signature to route millions of dollars into shell companies registered exclusively in your name." Brittany's breath hitched. She spun around to face DeAndre, her voice bordering on absolute hysteria. "You told me it was an internal restructuring protocol. You said my signature was just a formality for the compliance department." DeAndre refused to look at her. He stared straight ahead, his jaw clenched so tightly a muscle ticked violently in his cheek. "He set you up, Brittany?" I continued, ensuring my voice carried across the silent room so every board member and socialite could hear. "While you two were laughing in your condo, my cybersecurity team was already inside your network. We tracked the destination accounts. We mapped the entire digital footprint of the theft. Did you know my cybersecurity team just forwarded your encrypted offshore ledgers directly to the Securities and Exchange Commission?" Brittany let out a sharp, guttural cry, her hands flying to her mouth. Federal embezzlement. That was the unspoken phrase hanging heavily in the air. She was the vice president of acquisitions, but she had just been played by a master manipulator who fully intended to let her take the fall for his sweeping financial crimes. Right on cue, the suffocating silence of the dining room was shattered by the frantic, continuous buzzing of a cell phone. DeAndre reached into his tailored suit jacket with his uninjured hand and pulled out his device. The screen was lighting up with rapid-fire notifications. It was not just one call. It was a relentless avalanche of texts, emails, and emergency alerts from his executive team. His face turned an ashen gray as he scrolled through the messages, his eyes widening in unadulterated horror. Seconds later, several other phones across the dining room began to chime and buzz. The news was officially hitting the financial wires. "What did you do?" DeAndre breathed, his voice barely audible over the rising panic in the room. "I sent a small, anonymous data packet to every single one of your major investors." I said, my tone as cold as winter ice. "I showed them the offshore accounts. I showed them the shell companies. I showed them exactly how you have been systematically laundering Apex Capital client funds to cover up your massive trading losses over the last 4 years. And I showed them how you used your naive vice president's signature to execute the entire fraud." DeAndre looked back at his phone, his thumb swiping desperately across the cracked screen. The Reynolds account, the Sterling Trust, the state pension funds. He read the names aloud, his voice breaking. "They are pulling out. They are all submitting emergency withdrawal requests. You just triggered a bank run on my entire hedge fund." I triggered transparency. I corrected him, stepping back and folding my arms confidently across my chest. "You built an empire on lies, intimidation, and domestic abuse. You thought you could break my sister and steal her inheritance to keep your sinking ship afloat. I simply turned on the lights so your investors could see the rats scatter." Patricia rushed forward, grabbing DeAndre's good arm, her eyes wide with a new, raw kind of terror. "DeAndre, tell me she is lying. Tell me our retirement funds are safe. We put everything into Apex Capital. We gave you full discretionary control over our personal portfolios." DeAndre ignored her. He shoved her hands away with a violent jerk that made my father step forward defensively. The facade of the charming, wealthy son-in-law was completely gone. In his place stood a cornered, desperate animal. The realization that he was losing his company, his wealth, and his freedom was finally crashing down on him. He looked around the room, seeing the disgusted faces of the elite socialites and politicians who had praised him just moments ago. People were already standing up, grabbing their coats, eager to distance themselves from a man about to be indicted by the federal government. He was ruined in Atlanta, he was ruined globally, but malignant narcissists never surrender gracefully. They always look for one final destructive blow to drag everyone else down into the abyss with them. DeAndre slammed his good fist down heavily onto the head table. The impact rattled the crystal champagne flutes and sent a silver serving tray crashing to the floor. His eyes locked onto mine, blazing with a toxic mix of pure hatred and manic desperation. "You think you are smart?" DeAndre sneered, spit flying from his lips as he took a threatening step toward me. "You think you can just march in here and destroy my life without catastrophic collateral damage? I am the majority shareholder of Apex Medical, the company your father runs." The entire room sucked in a collective breath. Apex Medical was the pharmaceutical manufacturing giant my father managed. It was the absolute crown jewel of our family's generational wealth. It was the very institution Richard had spent his entire life building, only to secretly sell a controlling stake to DeAndre to fund his lavish country club lifestyle. "That is right." DeAndre laughed, a harsh, ugly sound that echoed off the vaulted ceilings. "I own your father's company. I control the board of directors, and tomorrow morning the board will vote to liquidate Hailey's legacy shares to cover my immediate hedge fund losses. You might have taken my house, Jordan, but I am going to bankrupt your entire bloodline." The morning sun glared off the towering glass facade of the Apex Medical headquarters. On the 42nd floor, the executive boardroom was an intimidating expanse of polished mahogany, brushed steel, and panoramic views of the Atlanta skyline. It was designed to make anyone who walked in feel small. Today, it was meant to be the execution chamber for Hailey's legacy. Richard sat at the head of the massive conference table, his posture radiating false solemnity. Patricia sat to his right, wearing a somber black dress that screamed calculated mourning. DeAndre sat to his left, his broken arm resting prominently on the table in a pristine white sling. Brittany hovered just behind DeAndre, acting as his proxy executive assistant, her eyes darting greedily around the room. 12 senior board members occupied the remaining leather chairs. They were older men and women who controlled billions in pharmaceutical manufacturing, and they looked deeply uneasy. The emergency meeting had been called at dawn. Richard stood up, buttoning his suit jacket with a heavy sigh. "Thank you all for coming on such short notice," he began, his voice thick with rehearsed sorrow. "As CEO, it is my duty to protect Apex Medical from external volatility. As a father, it breaks my heart to address the internal volatility threatening us today." A murmur rippled through the board. Richard projected a document onto the massive digital screen at the end of the room. It bore the official seal of a prominent Atlanta psychiatric facility. "Many of you have known my daughter Hailey since she was a child." Richard continued, looking down at his hands as if fighting back tears. "It is with profound devastation that I must inform the board of her sudden and violent psychological collapse. Last night, Hailey suffered a complete break from reality. She attacked her husband DeAndre, causing severe physical injuries." Patricia reached out, placing a comforting hand over DeAndre's good arm. DeAndre lowered his head, playing the traumatized survivor flawlessly. Richard pointed to the screen. "What you are looking at is a legally binding medical directive signed by the Chief of Psychiatry at St. Jude's Medical Center. Hailey has been placed under a mandatory involuntary psychiatric hold. She is heavily medicated and completely incapable of managing her affairs." The forgery was Patricia's masterpiece. She had spent the early hours of the morning calling in favors, bribing a crooked administrator, and falsifying medical records to ensure Hailey looked completely unhinged. It was the ultimate betrayal. A mother legally erasing her own daughter's sanity to cover up her son-in-law's financial crimes. A senior board member named Marcus leaned forward, frowning. "Richard, this is a terrible family tragedy, But why call an emergency board meeting? Hailey's personal health does not immediately impact our quarterly projections. DeAndre stood up, wincing theatrically as he adjusted his sling. He looked at Marcus with cold, dead eyes. It impacts the projections when my hedge fund is tied to this company, Marcus. As you all know, I hold a controlling interest in Apex Medical. My firm, Apex Capital, is currently facing a coordinated malicious cyber attack. An anonymous hacker has frozen my liquid assets and panicked my investors. If my hedge fund falls, Apex Medical's stock will plummet by association. We need immediate liquidity to stabilize the market. And where exactly is this liquidity coming from? Marcus demanded, his suspicion growing. Richard took over, his voice hardening into ruthless corporate efficiency. Hailey currently holds 30% of the legacy voting shares in this company. Shares she inherited directly from her grandfather. Given her current legal incapacitation, the company bylaws allow the board to trigger a contingency clause. I am moving for a vote to forcibly liquidate Hailey's entire stake and transfer the capital directly to DeAndre's firm. The room erupted into chaotic arguments. You are talking about stripping your own daughter of her inheritance? A female board member objected loudly. You are selling her shares back to the company for pennies on the dollar to bail out your son-in-law. It is for her own protection, Patricia interjected, her voice sharp and defensive. Hailey is sick. She does not understand the value of a dollar. She never has. DeAndre is the financial anchor of this family. If he falls, we all fall. We have a duty to protect the company's future, even if it means protecting Hailey from herself. Brittany stood behind DeAndre, tapping furiously on a tablet, preparing the transfer authorizations. Her smirk had returned. She was already calculating the massive commission she would skim off the top once the funds hit their offshore accounts. Richard raised his hands, demanding silence. The decision is painful but necessary. The paperwork has already been drafted. If we do not pass this resolution right now, DeAndre's firm will default by noon, and he will be forced to liquidate his controlling stake in Apex Medical to foreign buyers. We will lose the company. I need a show of hands. All those in favor of liquidating Hailey's shares under the medical incapacitation clause. Slowly, reluctantly, hands began to rise. The board members were trapped. Richard and DeAndre had engineered a perfect hostage situation. It was either sacrifice the absent, allegedly insane daughter or lose their own fortunes in the fallout of DeAndre's collapse. 5 hands went up, then 7, then 9. Richard smiled, a dark, victorious gleam in his eyes. The motion passes, he announced, picking up his pen to sign the executive order. The heavy mahogany doors at the back of the boardroom did not just open. They were shoved apart with such violent force that they slammed against the glass walls, the sound cracking through the room like a gunshot. Richard dropped his pen. DeAndre spun around, his face instantly draining of blood. Patricia gasped, clutching the edge of the table. The room inhaled a sharp collective breath as 2 women walked through the threshold, their footsteps echoing in perfect, intimidating synchronization. On the left stood Jordan, radiating lethal authority. I wore my dark Vanguard tactical blazer, my posture rigid, my eyes scanning the room and locking onto every single threat. I was the weapon. But the true shock, the sight that made the board members literally rise from their leather chairs, was the woman walking shoulder to shoulder with me on the right. It was Hailey. She did not look like the fragile, broken, hysterical housewife my parents had just spent 20 minutes describing. She looked like an absolute monarch. Hailey wore a stunning emerald green power suit that tailored perfectly to her frame. Her hair was blown out into sleek waves, her makeup was flawless, and her chin was tilted up in a display of unyielding confidence. The heavy, invisible chains of abuse she had worn for years were completely gone. She was radiant, she was powerful, she was terrifying. Patricia let out a strangled, breathless sound. The forged medical document on the digital screen suddenly looked like a pathetic, desperate lie. Brittany stepped back, her tablet slipping from her hands and clattering onto the floor. DeAndre stared at the doorway, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish. He looked from me to Hailey, his brain short-circuiting as he tried to comprehend the impossible reality standing in front of him. Hailey stepped forward, her heels clicking sharply against the polished wood. She looked directly at our father, her eyes burning with a cold fire that matched my own. "I hear you are trying to sell my shares." "Dad," Hailey said, her voice smooth, loud, and echoing with absolute authority. "But I am afraid your medical documentation is a bit outdated." She reached into her emerald jacket, pulling out a crisp, notarized legal document, and tossed it onto the center of the boardroom table. DeAndre's good hand gripped the edge of the mahogany table so hard his knuckles turned bone white. His gaze darted frantically back and forth between my face and Hailey's. The realization hit him with the devastating force of a freight train. The tactical gear in the dark, the shattered knee, the broken wrist, the absolute unyielding brutality of the woman in the penthouse. He looked at my Vanguard tactical blazer and then at Hailey's immaculate emerald suit. He finally understood he had not been fighting his subjugated, terrified wife last night. He had been fighting me. "You—" DeAndre choked out his voice, a pathetic, reedy gasp as he pointed a trembling finger at me. "It was you. You are the one who broke into my home. You are the one who attacked me." He stumbled backward, his chair scraping loudly against the hardwood floor. His suave, untouchable billionaire persona completely disintegrated, leaving behind a terrified, cornered coward. He spun toward the heavy double doors, his face slick with a cold sweat. "Security!" He shrieked, his voice cracking and echoing off the glass walls. "Get these women out of here right now. Arrest them for corporate espionage. Arrest them for trespassing and assault." The two heavily armed corporate security guards stationed inside the boardroom did not move toward us. Instead, they stepped forward in perfect, intimidating unison. They bypassed DeAndre entirely, their heavy boots thudding against the floor, and took up defensive positions directly behind my shoulders. They crossed their arms, their expressions turning to absolute stone. DeAndre stared at them, his mouth hanging open in sheer disbelief. "What are you doing?" he yelled, spit flying from his lips. "I pay your salaries. I own this company. Throw them out." I smiled, letting the cold reality of his absolute powerlessness wash over him. Vanguard Security took over the building contract at exactly midnight. "DeAndre?" I announced, my voice carrying a lethal calm to every corner of the silent room. "You do not pay their salaries anymore. I do. And they only take orders from me." The board members were completely paralyzed. Marcus, the senior director, stared at the forged medical document on the screen, and then at the very lucid, very composed woman standing beside me. Patricia was gripping Richard's arm so tightly, her fingernails were digging deep into his tailored suit jacket. Her meticulously crafted plan to institutionalize her own daughter was imploding in real time. Brittany had pressed herself against the back glass wall, desperately trying to become invisible, clutching her tablet like a shield. Hailey stepped up to the center of the boardroom table. She did not shrink under the intense, judgmental scrutiny of the corporate elite. She did not look down. She stared directly into the eyes of her abuser for the very first time, without a single trace of fear. Her gaze was steady, piercing, and utterly unbroken. DeAndre actually shrank back from her, intimidated by the sheer force of her newfound resolve. The massive digital screen behind them flickered, casting a pale, clinical light over the terrified faces of the executives. "I am of perfectly sound mind," Hailey stated, her voice ringing with an ironclad authority that made our mother physically flinch. She reached out and picked up a printed copy of the forged psychiatric document Patricia had distributed to the board. She held it up for everyone to see. "I am not under a psychiatric hold. I have not suffered a mental breakdown. And I am absolutely not selling my legacy shares to cover the catastrophic fraudulent failures of a corrupt hedge fund manager." Hailey ripped the document cleanly in half, letting the pieces flutter onto the polished wood table. She turned her attention to Patricia. "You forged a medical directive to have me locked in a psychiatric ward just to protect your wealth mother. You threw your own flesh and blood to a monster because it was financially convenient. You watched him isolate me. You watched him break me down, and you handed him the hammer." Patricia opened her mouth to speak, but no sound came out. The wealthy board members were muttering among themselves, the scandal too massive to ignore. The silence that followed was suffocating heavy with the realization that the power dynamic in the room had permanently violently shifted. Your convenient victim just woke up, Hailey continued, her voice echoing with undeniable power. And she is taking her life back. The shares stay with me. The motion to liquidate is legally void. I am invoking my right as a legacy shareholder to strike this entire proceeding from the record. Richard stood up abruptly, his chair tipping over behind him. Sweat was beading on his forehead and dripping down his collar. He looked completely unhinged, his life's work and his pristine social legacy crumbling to dust before his eyes. He slammed his hands onto the table, leaning forward with wild, manic eyes. You do not have a choice, Hailey, Richard shouted, his voice cracking with sheer, unadulterated desperation. You do not understand the leverage he has over us. You do not understand how the real world works. We need his capital to survive in this society. DeAndre's fund holds the debt on this entire company. He owns the mortgages on our manufacturing plants. He owns the supply chain credit lines. We leveraged everything to expand, and Apex Capital bought the debt. If you do not give him that capital right now, he will call in the loans and bankrupt Apex Medical by nightfall. He owns us. The boardroom erupted into chaos. The directors realized they had been kept in the dark about the true financial peril of the company. Richard had sold their future to a predator. DeAndre let out a breathless, ugly laugh, leaning heavily against the table. That is right, he sneered, regaining a fraction of his arrogant swagger. I hold the paper on this whole pathetic empire. You do not sign those shares over, I burn this building to the ground. You have nothing. I stepped forward, moving past my sister until I was standing directly across from DeAndre. I reached inside my Vanguard tactical blazer and pulled out a thick, heavy black binder. I tossed it onto the center of the boardroom table. The loud thud echoed like a gavel sealing a death sentence. The heavy black binder hit the polished mahogany with a resounding, violent slam that made the crystal water pitchers vibrate. For a fraction of a second, the entire executive boardroom held its breath. The 12 senior directors, my parents, and the armed security guards all stared at the leather cover as if it were a live, explosive device. DeAndre blinked, his good hand twitching on the table. The sight of Hailey standing tall and lucid, flanked by my Vanguard tactical presence, had momentarily scrambled his brain. But malignant narcissism is a stubborn, blinding disease. The sheer shock of our arrival quickly morphed back into the sneering, arrogant confidence that had allowed him to terrorize my sister and manipulate my parents for years. He adjusted his pristine white sling, rolled his shoulders back, and leaned comfortably into his plush executive chair. You can bring all the dramatic props you want, Jordan. DeAndre laughed, a dry, grating sound that echoed off the panoramic glass walls. It does not change the mathematical reality of this boardroom. She is right. I hold the paper on this company. I control the supply chain debt, the real estate mortgages, and the operational credit lines. You want to play savior for your crazy sister, go ahead. But if you stop this share liquidation, I will sink Apex Capital and I will drag Apex Medical straight down to the bottom of the ocean with me. I will bankrupt all of you before lunchtime. I did not flinch. I placed my hands flat on the cold mahogany table and leaned forward, invading his space until he was forced to press his back firmly against his chair. You really are a special kind of stupid, DeAndre, I stated, my voice echoing clearly across the dead silent room. Did you honestly think a multi-billion-dollar hedge fund could bleed cash for 4 consecutive years without vultures circling the carcass? Did you think you could just shuffle your toxic, highly leveraged debt through offshore accounts and no one in the financial intelligence sector would notice the stench? I flipped open the heavy black cover of the binder. Inside were hundreds of pages of highlighted bank transfers, aggressive debt acquisition records, and anonymous corporate registrations. I spun the binder around and shoved it across the slick table. It slid perfectly, stopping mere inches from his uninjured hand. For the last 6 months, Vanguard's shell companies have been buying up your toxic, highly leveraged debt, I explained, watching the smug satisfaction slowly drain out of his eyes. While you were busy shouting at Hailey, isolating her from the world, and funneling client money to your mistress. My network of phantom corporations was quietly purchasing every single scrap of your financial liability. Patricia let out a sharp, breathless gasp, her manicured hand flying to her throat. She looked from the binder to DeAndre, a new kind of panic dawning on her face. Richard sank slowly back into his chair, the blood completely draining from his cheeks, as the reality of my words began to penetrate his thick skull. He had sold the soul of his legacy company to a man who was already financially deceased. I leaned further over the table, dropping the final crushing weight of the truth directly onto his chest. "You do not hold the paper anymore, DeAndre," I said, my tone absolute ice. "I do. I own 60% of your fund's debt. I am your biggest creditor, and I am calling in the loans, effective immediately." The 12 senior board members erupted into a frenzy of panicked whispers. Marcus, the senior director, snatched the binder from in front of DeAndre and began frantically flipping through the verified acquisition documents. His eyes widened with every page he turned. He looked up at Richard, his expression twisting into pure, unadulterated disgust. "He is completely broke," Richard Marcus barked, slamming his fist against the table. "DeAndre's fund is a hollow shell. He has been using our corporate credit to prop up his failing investments, and your daughters just bought our entire debt portfolio. We do not answer to him, we answer to them." Hailey stepped forward, standing shoulder to shoulder with me. She looked down at the man who had spent years convincing her she was weak, useless, and entirely dependent on his mercy. DeAndre actually shrank back from her, intimidated by the sheer force of her newfound resolve. "You told me I was nothing without you, DeAndre." Hailey said, her voice steady and ringing with pristine clarity. "You told me no one would ever believe me. You told me my own family would lock me away before they ever let me touch my grandfather's legacy. You were right about our parents. But you were dead wrong about my sister, and you were completely wrong about me. I am of perfectly sound mind, and I am not selling my shares." DeAndre's chest heaved. The polished, untouchable billionaire facade shattered completely, revealing the pathetic, desperate fraud underneath. He was losing his leverage, his company, and his ultimate victim, all at the exact same moment. His eyes darted wildly around the boardroom, looking for an exit, looking for an ally, looking for any possible lifeline. He found nothing but the cold, furious stares of the corporate elite, who now realized they had almost been conned into giving away 30% of their company to a criminal. But cornered predators always have a final, desperate move. DeAndre spun his head toward Brittany, who was still cowering near the back glass wall. Brittany was the vice president of acquisitions. She had the security clearances, the administrative access, and the digital keys to the Cayman Island offshore accounts, where they had attempted to hide the stolen marital assets. "Execute the fail-safe protocol," DeAndre screamed, his voice cracking into a high-pitched shriek of absolute panic. "Do it right now, Brittany. Initiate the fail-safe protocol and scrub the external servers. Route the remaining cash into the ghost accounts before Vanguard freezes the main terminal. Burn it all down." Brittany snapped out of her paralyzed state. Her greedy survival instincts kicked into overdrive. She dropped to her knees, scrambling to pick up the tablet she had dropped moments earlier. Her fingers flew across the digital keyboard, frantically entering the override passwords and administrative bypass codes required to trigger their emergency asset liquidation protocol. She was sweating, her breath coming in ragged, desperate gasps as she tried to outsmart the digital perimeter. I did not move to stop her. I did not signal my tactical guards to intervene. I simply stood there and watched her try to breach an impenetrable fortress. "I am in, Brittany," breathed her thumb, hovering over the final execution command on the screen. "I am initiating the wipe." She pressed the button. Instantly, the massive digital projection screen at the front of the boardroom flashed violently. The forged psychiatric document vanished. In its place, a solid, blindingly bright crimson-red screen illuminated the terrified faces of everyone in the room. A massive black Vanguard intelligence logo materialized in the center of the display. Brittany let out a terrified scream. Her tablet screen mirrored the projection, locking up completely before turning pitch black. The automated voice of my lead cybersecurity architect echoed through the boardroom's surround sound speakers, confirming that the system override was denied and all administrative access had been permanently revoked. Every single offshore account was frozen. They were completely locked out. The blinding crimson light from the digital display washed over the terrified faces of the executive board, bathing the room in the color of DeAndre's absolute ruin. Brittany stood frozen, staring down at the blackened screen of her tablet. The Vanguard intelligence logo pulsed on the massive monitor behind her, a digital tombstone for their offshore empire. The silence in the boardroom was heavy thick with the undeniable reality that millions of dollars of stolen capital were now permanently out of their reach. Brittany dropped the useless tablet. It hit the polished hardwood floor with a sharp crack that echoed like a gunshot. She backed away slowly, her eyes darting between the frozen board members, my unwavering tactical guards, and finally DeAndre. Self-preservation is a powerful instinct. For months, Brittany had happily played the role of the smug, entitled mistress and willing accomplice. She had gladly helped DeAndre siphon away my sister's inheritance and launder Apex capital funds, dreaming of Cayman Island beaches and limitless wealth. But looking at the cold, hard, dead end she had just smashed into, that loyalty evaporated in a matter of seconds. She was looking at decades in federal prison, and she knew it. She spun around, pointing a manicured, trembling finger directly at DeAndre's chest, her voice pitched into a shrill, hysterical scream. "He forced me." The board members recoiled, pulling their leather chairs back from the table. Patricia gasped, her hands flying to her mouth, while Richard stood paralyzed. "I did not want to do any of this," Brittany shrieked, tears of sheer panic streaming down her face. She looked frantically at the senior directors, desperately trying to cast herself as the naive victim. "He forced me to sign those ledgers. I have emails. I have a hidden encrypted server proving he orchestrated the entire embezzlement scheme from the very beginning. He told me if I did not use my administrative credentials to route the funds, he would completely destroy my career and frame me for his trading losses. He made me do it." DeAndre stared at her, his jaw dropping as the magnitude of her betrayal registered in his eyes. The narcissistic billionaire, a man who had spent his entire life controlling the narrative and manipulating every single person in his orbit, had just been publicly stabbed in the back by his own partner in crime. His facade of the calm, calculating genius shattered into a million jagged pieces. The mask slipped, completely revealing the violent, unhinged predator Hailey had endured for years. "Shut your mouth, you stupid, treacherous liability!" DeAndre roared, a sound of pure, venomous rage tearing from his throat. Forgetting entirely about his supposedly broken wrist, DeAndre lunged across the space separating them. He moved with terrifying speed, his face twisted into a mask of pure violence, his good hand reaching like a claw directly for Brittany's throat. He never made it past the edge of the mahogany table. My Vanguard security team reacted with clinical, breathtaking brutality. They did not shout warnings. They did not hesitate. Two heavily armored operatives intercepted DeAndre mid-lunge. One guard grabbed his shoulder and his belt, using DeAndre's own forward momentum against him, while the other swept his legs out from under him in a seamless, fluid motion. The impact was deafening. They slammed DeAndre face first into the center of the executive boardroom table. The heavy mahogany groaned under the force of his body weight and the tactical armor pressing down on him. Crystal water pitchers shattered, sending shards of glass and ice water cascading over the polished surface. A guard twisted DeAndre's arm sharply behind his back, pinning him completely immobile against the wood. DeAndre let out a muffled, feral cry of pain and humiliation, his cheek smashed against the table, his expensive suit soaked in spilled water. The board members scrambled backward in absolute horror. Patricia let out a piercing scream, staggering away from the table as if she had just witnessed an execution. Richard looked like he was going to vomit. They had just watched the man they trusted with their fortune, the man they had chosen over their own daughter, attempt to violently assault a woman in front of a dozen witnesses. They finally saw the monster they had enabled. Brittany had collapsed against the glass wall, hyperventilating, her hands shaking as she stared at the man pinned to the desk. She looked over at Hailey, her eyes wide with desperate, pleading tears. Hailey, please, Brittany sobbed, sliding down the glass until she was crouched on the floor. You have to tell them. You know what he is like. You know how controlling he is. You know he made me do this. I will give your sister everything. I will hand over the encryption keys to his private servers. I will testify to the SEC. Just tell them I was a victim too. Hailey did not flinch. She did not show a single ounce of sympathy. She walked slowly around the shattered glass and spilled water, stopping just a few feet away from the trembling woman on the floor. Hailey looked down at Brittany with an expression of absolute, unbreakable strength. Turning state's evidence will not save you, Brittany. Hailey said, her voice echoing with a cold, terrifying authority. You are not a victim. You are a predator who simply got caught by a bigger predator. Hailey folded her arms, her emerald green suit immaculate against the chaotic backdrop of the boardroom. You thought you were so clever this morning, bragging about draining my marital assets. But my sister's cyber team did not just lock you out of those offshore accounts. They pulled every single byte of data from your devices. Vanguard intelligence already sent the metadata to the federal authorities. Brittany stopped crying, her breath hitching in her chest as the blood drained entirely from her face. They have the digital footprint. Hailey continued delivering the final devastating blow with surgical precision. The metadata shows you initiated the offshore transfers from your personal IP address using your personal devices outside of corporate hours. There is video footage of you laughing in his penthouse while you executed the trades. You were not under duress. You were shopping for yachts. You are going down right next to him. Brittany let out a hollow, agonizing whimper, burying her face in her hands as the inescapable reality of her future settled over her. On the table, DeAndre struggled weakly against the Vanguard guards, his breath coming in ragged, defeated gasps. His empire was gone, his leverage was gone, his freedom was gone. Richard stood frozen in the corner of the room, looking at me with eyes full of terror and regret. He opened his mouth to speak, to try and salvage some fraction of his legacy, to beg for mercy from the daughter he had consistently marginalized and betrayed. Before Richard could form a single word, a sound drifted through the panoramic glass windows of the 42nd floor. It started as a faint, distant wail echoing through the concrete canyons of downtown Atlanta. Within seconds, the sound multiplied, growing louder, sharper, and utterly undeniable. The piercing shriek of police sirens cut through the morning air, bouncing off the skyscrapers rapidly approaching the Apex Medical Building. The wail of the sirens grew from a faint, distant echo to a deafening roar that vibrated against the thick glass of the 42nd floor windows. The flashing red and blue strobe lights began to reflect off the surrounding skyscrapers, casting frantic, pulsing colors into the dim boardroom. Several senior board members abandoned all corporate decorum and rushed to the floor-to-ceiling windows, staring down at the street level in sheer panic. A dozen black tactical police SUVs and heavily marked cruisers were swarming the corporate plaza, blocking every exit and barricading the underground parking garage. DeAndre stopped struggling against the desk. He went completely limp under the crushing weight of the Vanguard security operatives, his eyes wide and hollow. The reality of federal prison was staring him right in the face. Brittany curled tighter into a ball against the glass wall, weeping hysterically, her expensive mascara running down her face in dark, ugly streaks. But Patricia did not look at the windows. She did not look at the police cruisers. She looked at the flashing red Vanguard logo on the projector screen, and she finally calculated the brutal math of her own survival. If DeAndre was arrested, his assets would be seized. If his assets were seized, the massive off-the-books allowance he secretly paid her and Richard every single month to maintain their lavish lifestyle would vanish instantly. Their mansions, their private jets, their elite social standing in Atlanta was entirely tied to DeAndre's dirty money. Panic, raw and ugly, twisted Patricia's meticulously preserved face. She lunged forward, her high heels clicking frantically across the hardwood floor, completely ignoring the shattered glass and spilled water. She bypassed me entirely and threw herself at Hailey. Patricia grabbed Hailey's hands, gripping them with desperate, bruising force. Her eyes were wide, pleading, stripping away decades of cold maternal distance in a frantic bid for self-preservation. "Hailey, sweetheart, please," Patricia begged, her voice trembling with manufactured maternal affection. "You have to stop this. Tell Jordan to call off her security team." Tell her to unlock the servers right now. We can handle this privately. We can settle all these financial disputes behind closed doors like a respectable family." Hailey just stared at her, an expression of profound, chilling detachment settling over her features. "If DeAndre goes down today, the press will crucify us." Patricia continued her grip, tightening her voice, rising to a frantic pitch. "The scandals will destroy the company stock. Your father and I will lose everything. Our homes, our reputation, our entire lifestyle will be completely ruined. You cannot do this to your own parents. Think of the family, Hailey. Please, you have to protect the family." Hailey looked down at Patricia's hands clutching hers. Then, with a sudden violent motion, she yanked her arms back. The force of the rejection sent Patricia stumbling backward, her jaw dropping in absolute shock. Family, Hailey repeated the word, dripping with pure, unadulterated venom. "You want me to protect the family. You want me to protect the exact same people who watched me walk around with bruises on my arms and told me to wear long sleeves so the neighbors would not talk." Patricia swallowed hard, her eyes darting nervously toward the board members who were now turning their attention away from the windows and back to the center of the room. "Hailey, keep your voice down," she whispered frantically. "No, I will not keep my voice down," Hailey stated, her voice ringing out like a cracked bell, commanding the immediate attention of every single person in the room. "You want to talk about protecting this family's pristine reputation. You mean like the time you and Dad stole $2 million from the country club's pediatric cancer charity auction?" The entire boardroom went dead silent. The sirens outside seemed to fade away entirely. Marcus, the senior director, turned around slowly from the window, his face drained of all color. Patricia gasped, her hands flying to her mouth, her eyes wide with sheer terror. Richard flinched as if he had been physically struck by a baseball bat. He gripped the edge of the mahogany table, his knuckles bone white, his breath suddenly catching in his throat. Hailey took a step forward, towering over our mother, projecting a lethal, unyielding dominance. "You thought I did not know?" Hailey continued her words, landing like physical blows in the quiet room. "You thought I was just the quiet, obedient daughter who never asked questions. But I saw the ledgers. I saw the absolute panic in our house 5 years ago when the federal auditors announced a surprise inspection of the charity funds. Dad was facing 20 years in federal prison for embezzlement." Hailey pointed a perfectly manicured finger down at DeAndre, who was still pinned helplessly against the table. "And that is when he stepped in, is it not? DeAndre found out about the missing $2 million. He wired the cash into the charity accounts through a dummy corporation covering your tracks, just hours before the auditors arrived. He saved you from federal prison, Dad. And in exchange, he demanded the exclusive supply chain contracts for Apex Medical. He demanded backdoor access to the company credit lines. And most importantly, he demanded me." The truth hung in the air, heavy, toxic, and absolutely devastating. The wealthy executives in the room stared at Richard and Patricia in abject horror. They had not just allowed their daughter to be abused. They had essentially sold her to a violent predator to buy their own freedom. They had traded Hailey's safety, her sanity, and her life to cover up a felony theft from a children's cancer charity. "You watched him break my ribs," Hailey said, her voice dropping to a deadly quiet register. "You watched him isolate me. You watched him slowly destroy my mind. And you never did a single thing to stop him because DeAndre had the receipts. He owned you. You were perfectly willing to let me die in that penthouse or rot in a psychiatric ward today as long as your secret stayed buried. You are not my family. You are my wardens, and your shift is officially over." Marcus stepped forward, his face flushed with righteous fury. "Richard, is this true?" Marcus demanded, his voice shaking with rage. "Did you embezzle from a pediatric charity and leverage this entire company to cover it up?" Richard opened his mouth, but no words came out. He looked at Marcus, he looked at Patricia, and then he looked at me. The absolute, inescapable reality of his situation crashed down on him with crushing force. The SEC would audit the company. The FBI would investigate the charity. The offshore accounts were permanently frozen. Vanguard owned his debt. He had absolutely nowhere left to run and no one left to bribe. A horrible, wet, wheezing sound escaped Richard's throat. He reached up his hand, clutching desperately at the center of his chest. His face turned a dangerous mottled shade of crimson. He swayed heavily on his feet, his eyes rolling back in his head, before his knees completely buckled. Richard collapsed violently into his leather executive chair, his body sliding sideways as he gasped for air, a massive heart palpitation gripping him. Patricia screamed his name, rushing to his side in a panic, but not a single board member moved to help them. They stepped away, physically recoiling from the toxic fallout of a ruined man. I watched the pathetic scene unfold with absolute coldness. I did not feel a single ounce of pity for the people who had tortured my sister. I raised my hand to my ear, pressing the comms unit hidden beneath my dark hair. The tactical channel buzzed softly in my ear. The perimeter was secured. The authorities were waiting in the lobby. "Send them up," I commanded, my voice flat and final. The heavy mahogany doors of the executive boardroom swung open again. But before the federal agents waiting in the corridor could even step over the threshold, DeAndre initiated his final catastrophic play. Adrenaline is a terrifying catalyst. Pinned against the ruined, water-soaked mahogany, his face pressed into the shattered remnants of crystal pitchers, DeAndre let out a guttural, feral roar. With a sudden violent convulsion fueled by pure survival instinct, he wrenched his uninjured arm free from the tactical operative's grip. He did not reach for a physical weapon. Instead, his bloody fingers clawed into the inner pocket of his ruined suit jacket and ripped out a heavily encrypted satellite-linked smartphone. "Wait!" he screamed, his voice tearing at his vocal cords, echoing off the panoramic glass like a cornered beast. "Nobody moves another inch." The Vanguard operatives instantly drew their batons, shifting their weight to strike, but I raised a single gloved hand, ordering them to hold their positions. I wanted to see exactly how deep his delusion went. DeAndre rolled onto his side, ignoring the tactical boot pressing firmly between his shoulder blades. He held the phone up high, his thumb hovering frantically over the glowing screen. His chest heaved, his eyes completely bloodshot and manic. He looked past me, past Hailey, past the horrified board of directors staring at the sheer drop of the Atlanta skyline behind us. "You think you outsmarted me, Jordan." DeAndre spat a line of bloody saliva dripping from his chin onto the polished floor. "You think because you wear tactical gear and buy up my debt that you are untouchable. You forgot who I am. I run Apex Capital. I buy and sell information that topples entire governments." He tapped the screen once, bringing up a secure dark web email client. The recipient list attached to the draft was massive. "I have classified files on Vanguard," he announced, his voice dropping into a venomous, triumphant sneer. "I have the unredacted operational logs from your private military deployments in Eastern Europe and South America. I have the unlogged financial transfers. I have every single ghost protocol you ever executed to keep your billionaire clients clean. And I have them loaded into a mass distribution email targeted at every major investigative journalist, federal oversight committee, and global news syndicate on the planet." A collective gasp ripped through the boardroom. Marcus took a stumbling step backward, colliding with a leather chair. Patricia let out a strangled whimper, realizing the fallout would not just end with financial ruin, but international criminal exposure. "If I hit send." DeAndre gloated, his eyes wild with the intoxicating thrill of mutually assured destruction. "I will leak every single one of your military operations. I will paint Vanguard as an unregulated rogue militia. I will frame you and your beloved sister as domestic terrorists plotting a corporate coup. I am going to prison, but I am dragging you both into a federal black site with me. We all burn today." The silence that followed was absolute. The air in the room felt thick, practically vibrating with the catastrophic weight of his threat. DeAndre smiled, a grotesque, broken expression of sheer malevolence. He slammed his thumb down on the send button. "Sent," DeAndre roared, throwing his head back and laughing. It was a maniacal, hysterical sound that scraped against the glass walls, the laugh of a man who believed he had just triggered the apocalypse. "You are dead, Jordan. Your company is dead. You are both finished." He continued to laugh, the sound grating and desperate, expecting the room to erupt into panic. He expected me to dive for the phone. He expected Hailey to scream. He expected the federal authorities in the hallway to charge in with weapons drawn. Instead, I simply stood there. I did not move a single muscle. I just watched him thrash on the table, letting the echo of his manic laughter fade into the suffocating silence of the boardroom. Then a sharp, crisp chirp broke the quiet. It was my personal smartphone resting securely in the breast pocket of my tactical blazer. I slowly reached inside, pulled out my device, and glanced at the glowing notification on the lock screen. I looked back down at DeAndre, whose laughter had abruptly died in his throat. The smug, victorious fire in his eyes flickered, replaced by a sudden creeping chill of uncertainty. A slow, cold smile spread across my face. I could not help it. I threw my head back and let out a genuine, deeply amused laugh. Did you really just try to send a mass cyber leak using a network routed through Vanguard servers? I asked, my tone dripping with lethal condescension. DeAndre froze entirely. The color drained from his face at a terrifying speed. His mouth opened, but his vocal cords refused to function. I took a slow, deliberate step toward the table, leaning over his pinned body. "You stupid, arrogant man," I whispered, ensuring every syllable carved into his shattered ego. Vanguard security took over the building's infrastructure at midnight. That includes the physical security, the cameras, the elevators, and the entire digital network. Every single byte of data that enters or exits this skyscraper runs through my cybersecurity firewall. Your encrypted phone connected to our localized cell tower spoofer the second you walked into the lobby this morning. You did not send an email to the press, DeAndre. You sent an email directly to my lead software engineer. DeAndre let out a sound that was half gasp, half sob. He dropped his phone. It clattered harmlessly against the mahogany, sliding into a puddle of spilled water. He was completely, irrevocably defeated. He had no leverage, no money, and now no weapons. "But we are not going to let your extensive contact list go to waste," I added, my smile sharpening into something predatory. "In fact, since you were kind enough to compile the personal emails of every single board member, every major investor, and every financial journalist in the country, my team decided to use it." DeAndre's eyes bulged. "What did you do?" He choked out, his chest heaving under the operative's boot. "What did you send them?" Right on cue, a synchronized symphony of digital alerts flooded the boardroom. It started with Marcus. His smartwatch chimed loudly. Then Richard's phone buzzed in his pocket. Then Patricia's designer handbag began to vibrate. Within 3 seconds, the pocket of every single senior executive in the room was buzzing, chiming, or ringing. The cascade of notifications rolled through the room like a digital shockwave. Hailey stepped forward, her emerald green suit catching the morning light, her posture radiating absolute victory. "Instead of your pathetic little smear campaign," Hailey announced, her voice slicing through the frantic buzzing of smartphones, "Vanguard just utilized your contact list to distribute an automated 4K video file. A video file compiled from the security cameras you thought you disabled in your penthouse, alongside the complete unredacted audio recordings of your embezzlement schemes, your offshore wire transfers, and every single threat you made against my life." The massive 90-inch projector screen at the head of the boardroom flared to life with blinding intensity. The Vanguard tactical tech team had synchronized the playback perfectly. Every single smartphone, tablet, and laptop resting on the mahogany table vibrated in unison, mirroring the giant display, trapping the executives in an inescapable surround sound nightmare. The first clip did not feature offshore accounts, wire transfers, or corporate espionage. It featured the penthouse. The footage was stark, rendered in unforgiving high definition from the hidden security cameras DeAndre believed he completely controlled. It showed DeAndre in his custom-tailored suit, his face contorted into a mask of pure malice, screaming at Hailey. He backed her into the edge of a marble kitchen counter, his physical presence looming and threatening. The audio was crystal clear, capturing the sickening, visceral thud as he violently shoved her against the stone. It captured his vicious, degrading threats, promising to destroy her family, promising to lock her away in a psychiatric facility if she ever dared to speak out against him. Patricia covered her eyes, a strangled gasp escaping her throat, but she could not block out the audio. Marcus, the senior director, stood completely frozen, his phone dangling limply from his hand as he watched the man managing their corporate wealth commit a brutal felony on a pristine 4K display. The scene shifted abruptly. There was no transition, just a brutal cut to the apex of corporate liability. It was the Apex Capital Executive Suite. DeAndre was pacing behind his desk, unleashing a vitriolic, deeply racist tirade against his own senior compliance team. He used slurs that made the room collectively flinch, boasting to a subordinate about how he owned them, how they were disposable, uneducated commodities existing solely to execute his fraudulent trades. It was absolute corporate poison. It was the kind of unhinged, documented bigotry that would instantly trigger a mass exodus of every institutional investor pension fund and government contract on their roster. Then came the grand finale, the definitive nail in their collective coffin. A split screen digitized across the projector. On the left, a scrolling list of bank routing numbers, offshore Cayman Island trusts, and encrypted wire transfers. On the right, a hidden camera feed from Richard's supposedly secure private suite at his elite country club. Richard and DeAndre sat across from each other in plush leather armchairs, clinking heavy crystal glasses of expensive scotch. DeAndre's voice echoed through the boardroom, crisp and undeniably incriminating. He explicitly outlined the exact mechanism of the corporate fraud. He detailed step by step how they were going to systematically leverage the Apex medical supply chain bleed, the investor dividend pool dry, and funnel the stolen capital directly through his shell corporations to cover the $2 million Richard and Patricia had embezzled from the pediatric cancer charity. Richard, sitting right there on the towering screen, laughed a deep, greedy belly laugh. He nodded in full agreement, explicitly confirming the timeline and completely incriminating himself in federal racketeering, wire fraud, and conspiracy. The video cut out the screen, plunging into darkness before the glowing Vanguard intelligence shield reappeared silent and imposing. The heavy, suffocating silence that descended upon the 42nd floor was the sound of a billion-dollar empire turning to dust. Marcus did not hesitate. The moral outrage was secondary to the sheer terrifying realization of his own financial exposure. He turned his back on Richard, who was still slumped sideways in his executive chair, gasping for air and clutching his chest. Marcus faced the remaining pale-faced board members, his voice shaking with a mixture of disgust and absolute survival instinct. As the senior-ranking board member of Apex Medical, Marcus barked his voice, echoing sharply off the panoramic glass, "I am initiating an immediate emergency vote of no confidence. I move to instantly terminate Richard's position as Chief Executive Officer effective this exact second. I move to sever any and all financial ties, supply contracts, and asset associations with DeAndre and Apex Capital. We freeze all internal accounts. We hand this entire building over to the federal authorities, and we cooperate fully and unconditionally." The chorus of agreement was instantaneous, a desperate, frantic scramble for self-preservation. The executives shouted their approval furiously, typing on their phones to contact their personal defense attorneys and PR crisis teams. They were jumping off the sinking ship, stepping over Richard's gasping body and DeAndre's ruined reputation to save themselves. The social and corporate assassination was absolute. In less than 3 minutes, DeAndre and Richard had been completely excised from the corporate world they once ruled like untouchable gods. On the shattered mahogany table, the reality of his total, inescapable destruction finally penetrated DeAndre's sociopathic delusion. His arrogance, the impenetrable armor of wealth and intimidation he had worn his entire life, completely shattered. The transition from apex predator to cornered prey was jarring, pathetic, and total. He stopped fighting the Vanguard operatives. He squirmed weakly, his face slick with cold sweat and blood from the broken glass, his eyes darting frantically around the room, looking for a single ally. He looked at Brittany, but she was rocking back and forth on the floor, staring blankly at the wall, ignoring him entirely. He looked at Richard, but the former CEO was practically catatonic. Finally, his desperate, terrified gaze landed on Hailey. "Hailey, please!" DeAndre begged, his voice cracking a high, reedy sound of pure, unadulterated panic. "You do not have to do this. I have money. I have hidden crypto wallets. Millions of dollars completely untraceable. I will give every single cent to you. I will sign the divorce papers right now. I will leave the country tonight, and you will never see me again. Just tell your sister to stop the upload. Tell her to wipe the servers and call off her guards. Please, Hailey, I am begging you on my life. Hailey looked down at the man who had tormented her, isolated her, and tried to break her spirit. Her expression was completely unreadable, a mask of beautiful, terrifying indifference. She adjusted the cuffs of her emerald green suit, standing tall and untouched by his pathetic display. You have absolutely nothing left to give me, DeAndre, she said, her voice dropping the temperature in the room by 10 degrees. And I do not negotiate with terrorists. DeAndre opened his mouth to scream another desperate plea, to offer another empty, meaningless bargain, but the words died in his throat. A sharp, melodic ding echoed through the reception area just outside the glass boardroom doors. The private executive elevator, previously locked down by Vanguard security protocols, had arrived at the 42nd floor. The heavy steel doors slid open with a smooth mechanical hum. A dozen men and women stepped out onto the plush carpet. They moved with coordinated military precision, their faces set in expressions of absolute authority. Across their backs, printed in bold, unmistakable yellow lettering on dark navy windbreakers, were the letters FBI and SEC. The lead agent, a tall woman with steel-gray hair and a deeply serious expression, stepped directly into the center of the boardroom. She did not even blink at the sight of the shattered mahogany or the tactical Vanguard operatives holding the CEO of Apex Capital down against the ruined wood. She simply held up a thick stack of manila folders. They were federal warrants signed by a federal judge just 20 minutes prior, authorizing the complete and total dismantling of the Apex Capital financial empire. The board members parted like the Red Sea. The senior executives practically pressed their backs against the panoramic glass windows, desperate to avoid any physical proximity to the impending arrests. The SEC agents immediately flooded the room, moving with clinical efficiency. They began confiscating every laptop, every tablet, and every smartphone left abandoned on the conference table. Another team of agents swept past us, heading straight for Richard's private office down the hall to seize the physical ledgers and secure the private servers. The lead agent walked right up to the desk where DeAndre was pinned. DeAndre, she stated, her voice projecting an absolute, undeniable authority that cut through the lingering chaos. You are under arrest for conspiracy to commit wire fraud, massive and systemic violations of the Securities Exchange Act, corporate embezzlement, and international money laundering. I gave a curt, silent nod to my security operatives. The Vanguard guards immediately released their crushing hold on DeAndre and stepped back seamlessly, transitioning perimeter control to the federal agents. Two burly FBI agents hauled DeAndre off the ruined table. His expensive, custom-tailored Italian suit was torn at the shoulder and completely soaked in ice water. His face was bruised, swelling rapidly where it had impacted the heavy wood. He struggled weakly, his polished shoes slipping on the wet floor, but the agents were merciless. They slammed him forcefully against the structural glass wall, wrenching his arms roughly behind his back. The sharp metallic click of heavy steel handcuffs echoing through the silent boardroom sounded like a vault door slamming shut on his entire existence. Across the room, Brittany finally realized her desperate plea for immunity had been a complete delusional fantasy. A female SEC agent approached her, pulling a pair of handcuffs from her belt and reciting the exact same list of devastating federal charges. Brittany shrieked a high, piercing sound of pure terror. She thrashed her arms wildly, sobbing hysterically that she was just an administrative assistant, that she was heavily coerced, that she had encrypted emails to prove her complete innocence. The federal agent simply grabbed Brittany by the wrists, completely ignoring her frantic, hysterical wails, and locked the steel cuffs tight around her manicured hands. Brittany collapsed to her knees on the plush corporate carpet, begging and screaming for anyone to help her. Not a single board member even looked in her direction. Self-preservation had entirely overridden whatever loyalty she thought she commanded. Richard remained slumped heavily in his leather executive chair, His face was a terrifying mottled shade of gray, his hands still clutching desperately at his chest. A paramedic team escorted by two heavily armed federal agents entered the boardroom with a stretcher. An FBI agent stood over the former CEO, coldly informing Richard that he was officially under federal arrest for racketeering and conspiracy. The agent made it brutally clear that the ambulance waiting in the loading dock would transport him directly to the hospital under armed federal guard, and his heart palpitation would not grant him a get-out-of-jail-free card. The lead agent grabbed DeAndre by the shoulder and spun him around to face the room. She looked him up and down with an expression of profound disgust, then began to read him his Miranda rights in a loud, unwavering voice. "You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney." The stark reality of those famous words finally broke through the last remaining layers of DeAndre's narcissistic delusion. He looked frantically around the boardroom. He saw the utterly disgusted faces of the wealthy executives he used to bully and intimidate. He saw the cold, unyielding professionalism of the federal agents dismantling his life's work. He saw the terrifying, heavily armored presence of my Vanguard tactical team blocking every possible exit. His criminal empire was officially dead. His stolen money was gone. His leverage had completely evaporated into thin air. Then his frantic, bloodshot eyes darted across the room and landed on my sister. Hailey was standing tall, her posture immaculate. Her emerald green suit caught the morning light streaming through the windows, radiating a quiet, unbreakable strength. The woman who had cowered in penthouses and hidden her bruises under long sleeves was entirely gone. In her place stood a survivor who had meticulously engineered the downfall of a monster. DeAndre's breathing became ragged and shallow. He lunged forward against the FBI agent's unyielding grip, his voice cracking with pure, pathetic desperation. Hailey DeAndre cried out, the sound grating and desperate, echoing off the glass walls. "Hailey, you have to help me. You are my wife. You are legally my wife. You have spousal privilege." The federal agents tightened their grip on him, but DeAndre kept straining toward her, his arrogant facade completely shattered by the looming threat of decades in a federal penitentiary. "They cannot force you to testify against me in federal court." DeAndre begged, tears of pure terror finally spilling down his bruised, swollen cheeks. "You can refuse to take the stand. You can block the audio recordings from being entered into evidence. You can claim the security videos were doctored by Vanguard. Please, Hailey, I will give you whatever you want. I will sign whatever Jordan puts in front of me. Just invoke spousal privilege. Protect me from the SEC. Tell them the domestic disputes were just arguments. Please, you promised to honor our marriage." For years, DeAndre had enforced one absolute, unbreakable rule in their household. He had beaten it into her psychologically and physically. Whenever he was angry, whenever he was asserting his dominance, he explicitly forbade Hailey from looking him in the eye. He demanded she keep her head down, a physical, degrading manifestation of her complete submission to his will. Hailey took a slow, deliberate step forward. The FBI agents paused momentarily, allowing the confrontation. Hailey stopped mere inches from DeAndre's ruined face. She did not lower her gaze. She did not look at the floor. She did not look at the federal agents holding him captive. She lifted her chin, defying years of conditioned terror and systemic abuse. Hailey looked him dead in the eye. "I don't know you." The lead FBI agent barely spared DeAndre another glance as the tactical operatives hauled him and the sobbing Brittany toward the freight elevators. Her sharp eyes locked onto the head of the mahogany table. Richard was still slouched in his executive leather chair, trembling violently as the paramedics checked his vitals. The agent marched directly up to him, pulling a secondary warrant from her thick manila folder. "Richard Adams," she announced, her voice slicing through the chaotic hum of the boardroom. "You are under arrest for conspiracy to commit wire fraud, tax evasion, and the felony embezzlement of $2 million from the Pediatric Oncology Foundation." Richard let out a pathetic, wheezing gasp, his face turning a sickly shade of gray. Two federal agents stepped forward immediately. They hauled him out of his chair, pulling his limp arms behind his back to secure the heavy steel cuffs, completely ignoring his frantic hyperventilation. Patricia finally snapped. The reality of losing her sprawling mansion, her exclusive country club membership, and her freedom shattered the final remnants of her perfectly curated high society facade. She let out a guttural, terrifying shriek. Realizing that begging the federal agents would achieve absolutely nothing, she spun around and locked her panicked eyes directly on me. She scrambled across the polished hardwood floor on her hands and knees, her expensive designer skirt tearing on a stray shard of shattered glass. She did not even flinch. She threw herself onto the carpet at my feet, her manicured hands frantically grabbing at the reinforced fabric of my tactical boots. "Jordan, please," Patricia wailed, her face entirely streaked with black mascara and terrified tears. "You have to stop this. You own this security company. You have the leverage. You have the money. Pay them off. Buy the debt. Settle the accounts. Do whatever it takes to make these agents leave. We are your parents. You cannot let them take us away in front of everyone." I stood perfectly still, looking down at the hysterical woman clutching my ankles. I felt absolutely nothing. No pity, no residual familial loyalty, just the cold clinical satisfaction of watching a long overdue debt finally being paid in full. This was the exact same woman who had packed my bags a decade ago. The same woman who had stood in the grand foyer of our sprawling estate and told me I was dead to her because I refused to marry a wealthy hedge fund manager. She had exiled me, completely cutting off my college tuition and my inheritance, forcing me to build my Vanguard empire from the absolute ground up in the mud and the blood of military deployments. She had happily traded Hailey to a violent monster just to keep her own closet full of designer clothes. I slowly reached down and firmly pried her shaking fingers off my boots. I leaned in close, ensuring the federal agents busy with Richard could not hear me, but making sure every single syllable burned directly into her mind. "You told me I was a worthless burden because I would not marry for money." I whispered, my voice completely devoid of emotion. "Now your rich son-in-law is in handcuffs. How is that for a return on investment?" Patricia flinched as if I had struck her across the face with a physical weapon. The color drained entirely from her artificially bronzed cheeks, leaving her looking hollow-aged and utterly defeated. She scrambled backward, her hands slipping on the wet mahogany and shattered crystals shrinking away from my tactical boots until she collided with the legs of a federal agent. She had no leverage left. The daughter she had discarded like garbage was now the architect of her absolute ruin. Richard, watching his wife crumble into a pathetic, sobbing mess on the floor, realized instantly that I was an impenetrable wall. I was not the scared teenager he could bully, nor the desperate daughter seeking his conditional validation. I was the executioner. Panicking, his chest heaving under the grip of the two FBI agents holding him down, Richard pivoted his strategy. He turned his frantic, bloodshot eyes toward the perceived weak link in the room. He targeted the daughter he had spent a lifetime conditioning to obey. Hailey, Richard bellowed, attempting to summon the booming, authoritative CEO voice that had terrified boardrooms for decades. It failed completely, coming out as a desperate, reedy crack. "Hailey, tell her, stop this right now. Tell your sister to call off these agents. We are your parents. We gave you everything. We gave you the best schools, the cars, the lifestyle. We protected you." He strained against the steel cuffs biting into his wrists, his face contorted in a mask of manipulative rage. "You owe us, Hailey. You owe this family. Do not let her do this to us. Tell her." The silence in the boardroom was absolute, broken only by the ragged breathing of the cornered executives and the steady hum of the building's ventilation. The federal agents paused, their eyes shifting between the disgraced patriarch and the stunning woman in the emerald green suit. They expected her to crack. They expected the lifelong conditioning of a toxic family dynamic to take hold for the obedient golden child to finally break down and defend the monsters who raised her. Hailey did not flinch. She did not lower her eyes, and she did not nervously wring her hands. She stepped forward, moving with a fluid, predatory grace that mirrored my own. She stood shoulder to shoulder with me, presenting a united, unbreakable front. She looked down at the man who had traded her to a sociopath just to secure a corporate merger. "You never understood how the real world works," Dad Hailey said. Her voice was remarkably steady, carrying a lethal, icy calm that echoed perfectly across the ruined boardroom. You thought the real world was just a game of leverage, a place where you could buy people, sell your daughters, and hide your crimes behind country club memberships and offshore accounts. You thought you could control me forever by making me feel weak and dependent. Richard stared at her, his mouth opening and closing in stunned, breathless silence. The absolute certainty in her eyes terrified him far more than the federal agent standing at his back. "But you were wrong," Hailey continued, taking one final step closer until she was looking directly down into his panicked face. "I am strong. I do not need to play a part for this toxic family anymore. I do not need your money, I do not need your approval, and I certainly do not need your protection." Without breaking eye contact, Hailey reached into her designer briefcase, resting on a nearby chair. She pulled out a thick, meticulously organized legal dossier. The pages were bound in heavy stock stamped with the official seals of both Vanguard's corporate attorneys and the United States Department of Justice. She dropped the heavy folder directly onto the mahogany table right in front of Richard's face. The loud, definitive smack of the paper hitting the wood made him jump. "These are the final severance documents," Hailey stated, her tone entirely clinical and detached. "They officially dissolve the irrevocable family trust you used to hide your embezzled charity funds. They permanently revoke the medical and financial power of attorney you secretly maintained over my accounts. Furthermore, they contain my fully sworn, unredacted testimony to the SEC and the FBI, detailing exactly how you and DeAndre colluded to commit wire fraud. Every single familial and financial tie between us is officially permanently severed. You are nothing to me now but a federal informant's target." Richard let out a strangled, pathetic gasp, sagging against the agents holding him. His eyes rolled back slightly, the sheer magnitude of her betrayal, the realization that his quiet, obedient daughter had meticulously orchestrated his imprisonment, finally overloading his system. Patricia, still sobbing on the floor, lunged toward the table, but a female FBI agent immediately intercepted her. The agent pulled Patricia to her feet with zero hesitation, ignoring her expensive designer clothing and hysterical protests. "Patricia Adams," the agent declared, her voice ringing out with federal authority, "you are under arrest for conspiracy to commit wire fraud and felony embezzlement of charitable funds. You have the right to remain silent." The sharp metallic click of handcuffs locking around Patricia's wrists echoed the exact sound that had just sealed her husband's fate. She shrieked a high-pitched, humiliating wail, begging the agents to let her go, screaming that she had a gala to attend, that she was a prominent board member of the regional country club. The federal agents ignored her completely. They hauled Richard and Patricia toward the glass doors of the boardroom in a synchronized, unceremonious march. The Vanguard tactical operatives held the perimeter, ensuring the disgraced couple was paraded directly past the sprawling floor of open-plan cubicles. Hundreds of Apex medical employees, the very people Richard and Patricia had bullied and exploited for years, stood at their desks, holding up their phones, recording every single second of the ultimate corporate downfall. By dinner time, the footage of the elite, untouchable Addams family being frog-marched out of their own skyscraper in federal handcuffs would be playing on a continuous loop across every major evening news network in the country. The pristine billionaire reputations they had sacrificed their own daughters to protect were permanently, irrevocably incinerated. 2 weeks later, the swift and unforgiving reality of the United States federal justice system finished the job. The media circus surrounding the Apex medical collapse and the subsequent Apex Capitol raid dominated the 24-hour news cycle. Financial anchors and legal analysts dissected the leaked Vanguard security footage frame by frame, broadcasting DeAndre's spectacular downfall to the entire globe. Inside the heavily guarded federal courthouse, DeAndre's high-priced defense attorneys were utterly useless against the mountain of digitized evidence. The presiding federal judge took one look at the transcript where DeAndre explicitly threatened to flee the country and denied him bail, instantly labeling him an extreme flight risk. He was remanded to federal custody, stripped of his tailored suits and staring down the barrel of a mandatory minimum 15-year sentence in a maximum security penitentiary for racketeering, wire fraud, and severe SEC violations. The Department of Justice immediately seized his entire financial portfolio, aggressively liquidating his real estate, his luxury vehicles, and his offshore accounts, to begin the massive process of paying back the defrauded pediatric charity and institutional investors. Brittany attempted one final desperate maneuver to save herself. She turned state's evidence, frantically offering the federal prosecution every single password, encrypted ledger, and hidden routing number she possessed in exchange for a lenient plea deal. The prosecution gladly took the data, but offered zero mercy. The SEC permanently stripped her trading license, banning her from the financial sector for life, while the judge approved a plea agreement that still guaranteed her a minimum of 24 months in a federal correctional facility. Her blind, foolish loyalty to a sociopath had cost her everything. While the criminal courts dismantled DeAndre's fraudulent empire, the civil courts systematically severed his legal grip on Hailey. Vanguard's elite corporate legal team moved with lethal efficiency. They activated a fiercely ironclad abuse clause buried deep within the original prenuptial agreement. With the undeniable 4K video footage of DeAndre's physical assault submitted directly into evidence, the family court judge completely voided the standard marital asset split protocol. The divorce was expedited and finalized in absolute record time. Hailey retained total uncontested ownership of all her unlaundered assets, her personal accounts, and the deed to the multi-million-dollar penthouse, leaving DeAndre with absolutely no claim to her wealth. She walked away from the legal wreckage with her finances perfectly intact, but more importantly, she walked away with her dignity restored and her spirit unbroken. The heavy brass doors of the federal courthouse swung open, and Hailey stepped out onto the wide granite steps. The morning air was sharp cold and incredibly crisp. For the first time in 3 years, she drew a deep, unobstructed breath. There was no fear tightening her chest, no looming shadow dictating her every movement, and no toxic family demanding her submission. She was entirely free. She walked down the stone steps, her heels clicking rhythmically against the pavement. At the bottom of the plaza, parked securely at the curb, sat a sleek, heavily armored black SUV. Leaning casually against the reinforced door, wearing her signature dark tactical blazer and a faint victorious smile, was Jordan. I pulled open the heavy armored door of the SUV as she reached the bottom step. We did not exchange immediate words. The air between us was entirely clear, stripped of the suffocating tension that had defined our lives for the past decade. Hailey stepped into the vehicle and I slid into the driver's seat, pulling away from the federal courthouse and leaving the wreckage of our former family in the rearview mirror. The drive through the city felt incredibly light. The toxicity of our past, the manipulation of our parents, and the violent control of her ex-husband were entirely burned away. We were finally just two sisters sitting in the quiet aftermath of a war we had definitively won. "I am not keeping it," Hailey said quietly, breaking the comfortable silence as we merged onto the highway. I glanced over at her, raising an eyebrow. "The settlement money or the real estate?" "The penthouse," she clarified, a genuine radiant smile breaking across her face. "I signed the listing paperwork this morning. The property sold in cash to an overseas buyer before the ink was even dry. I am liquidating everything I legally took from him." I smiled, keeping my eyes on the road. "That is a massive amount of capital, Hailey. What is your next move?" She sat up straighter, her eyes flashing with a fierce, unmistakable purpose. "I am establishing a foundation, a high-security legal defense fund specifically designed for women trapped in abusive marriages with wealthy, powerful men. I am going to use DeAndre's laundered millions to provide elite legal counsel, secure housing, and absolute financial independence for women who think they have no way out. The system protects billionaires. My foundation will dismantle them." A profound surge of pride washed over me. I looked at my twin sister, marveling at the incredible warrior she had become. "You are going to need serious physical protection for a venture like that," I told her, matching her fierce energy. "Billionaires do not let go of their assets easily. They will send fixers, private investigators, and hired muscle to intimidate your clients." Hailey turned to me, her smile sharpening. "That is exactly why my foundation needs a premier corporate security partner." "You have one," I replied instantly. Vanguard Security will provide top-tier tactical protection, secure transport, and digital firewall services for every single woman your foundation takes in, completely free of charge. We will be your permanent shield. Hailey reached across the console and took my hand. Her grip was incredibly strong. An hour later, we stood together on the sprawling rooftop terrace of Vanguard's corporate headquarters. The sky above the American skyline was bleeding into a brilliant canvas of deep purples and blazing golds. The wind caught our hair as we stood side by side, looking out over the city we had conquered. I handed Hailey a crystal flute of vintage champagne. We raised our glasses, the delicate crystal chiming brightly against the backdrop of the setting sun. We were no longer defined by the ruthless men who had tried to break us. We were no longer chained to the toxic parents who had tried to sell us for social currency. We were completely unbroken. We were fiercely independent. And finally, we were truly free. The most profound lesson woven through these narratives is that your true value is never determined by those who underestimate or mistreat you. When toxic family members project their insecurities onto you, using exclusion or financial manipulation as weapons, the greatest victory is walking away to build your own success. True independence isn't merely about financial wealth. It is about the emotional freedom to stop seeking validation from a broken system. You hold the ultimate power to redefine your legacy, transforming betrayal into the catalyst for personal triumph. Share your story in the comments below if you have ever had to walk away from a toxic environment to discover your true worth.